It's okay. We sent out the links. A few people will be joining us shortly, most likely. Give us a second. Okay, my friends, we are just sending out some links. This is going to be fun, and it goes along pretty well with what we did the last two live streams, the one this morning and the one last night. Got a lot of material on the subject of restoring a philosophically founded constitutional legitimate power structure from a slide into corruption. So we're going to do that. In just a moment. When a few people show up, we can get rid of that. The hour I first believed. So we're going to talk about Plutarch tonight, and it's going to be pretty groovy. Just making sure the tech things are working here. Okay. You know what? While we're setting up all the tech stuff, we ought to put something up here. How do we do that? Would be fitting to play while we get ready. It's a good question, and I don't know the answer. So this morning we read half of Bastiat, and we talked about the inevitable slide into corruption, even from a very well-founded, philosophically constituted um, political structure. And we're going to finish reading that at some point. And the night before, we watched The King, which was Kenneth Branagh's adaptation of the Shakespearean play. And we watched it and we discussed the nature of the deep state and how it's ever been thus, and that you don't have to really posit some scheming group of people that are making things, happen behind the shadows. It's sort of predictable and expected that there will be certain interests and forces. And we got to see with Baste, everybody doing what's in their personal interest is what's pushing this in the direction that it's pushing it. But today, in connection to all of that, what we want to look at is a time in history when there was a nation that was founded by philosophers on philosophical principles. It was constituted consciously, very unique and very different from all of the nations around it and the other city states. Very unique nation that was birthed into the world, positives and negatives. We'll talk about all that. But the exact same thing happened to them for the exact same types of reasons. And this system of sliding into corruption, where everyone on the left and everyone on the right, and everybody, no matter what their class or their special interest group, was forced by everybody else to keep pushing in that same direction because everybody else was. And then, after centuries of existing and then slowly sliding into this corruption, there was a wealthy, successful person in that city state who was born to a wealthy person who was so successful. And he just looked around at everybody else and he said, "You know what? This sucks for all of us, doesn't it? It's way worse than if we were just the way we were originally. What do you say we all just go back to how it was before?" And they just literally hit the reset button. Historically, this actually happened. They just hit the reset button and went right back to the way they were when their nation was founded philosophically with those original principles. So it's possible. There's a historical precedent for it, and it's possible. And that's what we're going to read about. We're going to do other things in Plutarch, and I'm excited to talk about what we can do. Um, by paying attention to history, by realizing that we are the product of Rome and Athens and Sparta and London and Bombay and Tehran. We're the product of these great cultural accomplishments and Philadelphia. But what we can do is get in touch with who it was that left us this legacy and find out more about ourselves by reading who our ancestors were in history. And so there's going to be a lot we're going to do with Plutarch, and that'll be really fun. But today, what we're going to do is we're going to focus on this one weird nation that was born philosophically, descended over centuries into, just slowly, step by step, into a kind of corruption where everything seemed broken and seemed aimed in the opposite direction of why it was founded in the first place. And then this magical reset button that they just said, "Hey, let's just go back. It was better for everybody." Literally every single person. There's no class or group or force in the system we have now that wishes it was still like this. But there's also no group that can go back without everybody else also deciding simultaneously to go back. But it happened once in history. So it's going to take us a little while because we're going to have to read about the founding of that nation first before we have a context for understanding the reset. And that's probably what we're going to do today. But I think it's going to be really fun. We're waiting for a few people who are going to show up and add to the discussion and join the live stream. I think I didn't really send the link everywhere I was supposed to, but let me just see here. But that's what we're going to do this evening. So welcome, and I'm glad to have you here. And let's see here. So if you just give us a moment, we're going to start. We're going to start in a few minutes, and we're going to start reading about Lycurgus, and that's going to be fun. we should have some sort of like music or something playing while we get set up. Does anybody have any suggestions? You DM me of something I should do with this software. Don't know. If you want to join, DM me and I'll send you a link where you can join the live stream for the discussion. We'll treat it like a Twitter space. If you're watching on YouTube, the other two videos where we watched The King together and discussed it and the nature of the deep state and all that fun stuff, and where we read the first part of Bastier's description in 1850 of how great the American setup was, but the inevitability of an increase in the lobbying uh, monstrosity and the inevitable place where he just describes our history and to where we are today and explains the forces of why that's a ratchet system and why it just sort of has to move in that direction, how everybody has to get sucked into it because of everybody else doing it. Those are the last two live streams we did, but they're only available on X. This one's going on YouTube as well. And we're gonna have a good time. We're gonna get together and read, and it's gonna be fun. I'm not gonna start until two people show up. So bear with us. We're gonna start in a little while here. If you're watching and you'd like to join, then just send me a DM and I'll send you a link and we can discuss Plutarch together. Now, if I move this down here, that mostly works. And that'll work. Oh, it's going to be like that. I see. Okay. I have to get used to reading like that. All right. Good lessons to learn. So this is going to fit in really well with the last two and with the next group of live streams that we're going to do. The last two we did was watching The King together. We watched the whole movie and discussed the nature of power and the deep state and politics, and it's ever been the way that it is now. And we got some interesting insights into that. And then this morning we started our reading of Bastiat, and you can check that out. And we're going to continue reading that at some point. But right now, what we're going to do is we're going to read about a historical event. We're going to read about the birth of a nation. I could tell the story a little bit. It's a really great story. But it's the birth of a nation that was founded in a philosophical perspective. A philosopher wrote all the laws, and everybody said, "Hey, we'll just go with that. You can be the we'll stick with that as our constitution, and we'll move forward that way, and those will be our laws." And for centuries, they lived and died for that way of life. And over time, tiny little cracks formed. And then, if your neighbor does this, then you have to do it to compete, but you're both worse off than if neither of you had done it, that type of thing. Exactly what we read with Bastiat to understand you don't need to imagine a twisted mustache or put a tinfoil hat on. It's just inevitable that this would be the way things go because of entropy. But what's really exciting is that this particular nation state whose founding we're going to read today, we're going to read another entry where after the corruption has gotten bad, one of the persons who was born to this state who was very successful, the billionaire of the time, just went into politics and said to everybody, "Hey, y'all want to just hit the reset button and let's go back to the way it was because this ain't working for anybody." And so there's a historical precedent for just deciding as a group, which nobody individually can move in the opposite direction when everybody's going the other way for personal interest, but where everybody can say, yeah, this is worse for all of us. Why don't we head back? So you can check out that last live stream. It's specifically about America. But today we're going to be focusing on, let's put this here. We're going to be focusing on an ancient Greek civilization that mirrors this. And we're going to look at some history lessons from that. So let's get started. Okay, this is about Sparta. Why don't I tell the story in brief and then we'll read about it? So, Lycurgus is the lawmaker for the Spartans. Um, there were a number of times when Greek city states got they tried to annex or draft a philosopher, say, hey, why don't you come and be a part of making our laws? And often the philosopher says, look, if you make me the tyrant and I get to write the laws and you have to obey them, then fine, but I'm not interested unless you're just going to let me write the laws. I don't want to be a part of some complicated system where everybody else's interests end up polluting what it is that I think is best. I think Plato declined to write laws for a city state because he said, look, I'm not going to be a legislator. I'm going to be the legislator or nothing. But Lycurgus took the job. And so the Spartans said, okay, we're going to go be a people somewhere. Why don't you tell us how to be? And we're going to see that it's a totalitarian system. We're going to see that it's a socialist system. For those of you who are on the left who hate the fact that people on the right love to point out, hey, there's never been a successful socialist uh, country or nation in the history of the world. The exception which proves the rule is Sparta. It proves the rule and it illustrates why there are no successful socialist societies otherwise, because the only way to have a successful socialist society is if everybody's in the military. The military is socialist anyway. People eat together and that type of thing to some degree. So if everything is totalitarian and military and militant, then you can, if everyone's in the army, the children, the women, everybody, then you can have your socialist dystopia or utopia. Will judge. This is going to be a very strangely set up country. It's philosophically imaginative and different. It worked for centuries. Its time of existence on Earth was longer than America has existed, which is one of the longest unbroken political traditions in the world today. Right? You say, well, France has been around forever. Yeah, they keep having revolutions. So America has lasted longer. There's other ways to view that. You say, well, we have a revolution every 4 years, and so we just sort of made it that it doesn't have to be bloody or something. And you can say, well, that's now fake and a show or whatever. And there's all sorts of criticisms we can discuss about the American system. But this ancient system, it's going to be a weird nation, but for centuries, men lived and died for the Spartan way of life. Lycurgus comes and writes the laws. And then he says to the people of Sparta, he says, listen, I have to go to Corinth or something. I have some business to attend to. I need all the elders to swear before me that you will obey these laws and follow them perfectly until I get back. Then we can discuss amendments and changes and things like that. But while I'm away, as long as I haven't yet returned, I got some business to do. I'll be back in a couple of months. While I'm away, you have to swear to follow these laws. And he goes to Corinth or wherever it was, and he commits suicide. And then he can never return. And they follow the laws for centuries. The reason why we're reading this is to set up a historical story about a nation that was founded philosophically. We were reading Bastiat this morning about the philosophical perspective of the founding fathers, natural law theory, how they viewed the legitimate and illegitimate sources of power, and say, well, these are pretty clever people who came together and consciously said, hey, what if we did it this way? And we're going to get to see another nation in the past that was done in that way, very different principles in lots of ways, but that was founded philosophically. And then we're going to see, after we're finished with that, we're going to read a different entry in Plutarch's Lives about an individual who says, okay, it's been centuries. We're not following the laws anymore. Tiny little corruptions have led to tiny little corruptions. And now, you know, we used to have no property. We had everything in common. Now everybody's got a slightly better spear than his neighbor. And then now we've got finery and now we've got all these things. And it's just a giant waste. It's not as good as it used to be. And he's a wealthy, successful member of this community. And he just looks around and he says, you guys just want to go back? Like, what if we just stopped and we just all reset and went back to where it was? And then for centuries, they lived that way again. It's really quite remarkable. So we're reading it for that reason. And let's see what we get. Let's see what happens here. Lycurgus. All right, so this is Plutarch writing about Lycurgus. So we've got the great questions of history and how it's done and things like that as well. I believe there's a way for me to see comments if you write them. I think comments on YouTube will show up and they can be shared. on the live stream. Also, if you'd like a link to join on camera, uh, even with just an avatar, just DM me and I'll send you a link to join. Let's get reading. There's so much uncertainty in the accounts which historians have left us of Lycurgus, the lawgiver of Sparta, that scarcely anything is asserted by one of them which is not called into question or contradicted by the rest. Their sentiments are quite different as to the family he came of, the voyages he undertook, the place and manner of his death, but most of all, when they speak of the laws he made and the commonwealth which he founded. Okay, so great deal of uncertainty. We're going to do history here, right? History is like literature. It's to inspire you to think about ways of being, but it's got the added empirical restriction of whatever story you tell me, it can't be based in imagination. It has to be, or not solely in imagination, it has to be based in with some empirical evidence that this is a story of what actually happened. And Plutarch says, well, we're shrouded in mystery here. We're half in mythology, or maybe more than half in mythology when we talk about Lycurgus. I've got a bunch of different historical sources. Hardly anything any of them say isn't contradicted by all the rest. So I'm going to have to do a lot of weighing and measuring and investigating to figure out, what I can sign my name to on this. The other thing that's worth pointing out here as we start this is probably the first bit of history that we've done. We've done a lot of philosophy and literature and mythology and other classes, but this is sort of the first bit of history that we've looked into is the nature of history. So let's talk about that briefly before we get into the text. Well, it's a part of the humanities, right? The humanities are there to answer or to make progress by asking deeper versions of or more subtly dissected versions of the question of what does it mean to be human and what is this human condition of ours. And the approach of history is to say, well, let me tell you about yourself by telling you a story of okay um of something that has happened, what your ancestors were like, what people happen to be like, what the world is like. Excuse me, with historical evidence. But it's a story, right? It's not the same as chronology, right? A chronicler just says, at 4:32, the king woke up from a nightmare on Tuesday, August 27th, and he called for his vizier who came in to him and he said, I am quite disturbed by my dream. He's just saying, at this time this happened, at this time this happened, at this time this happened. And when you take history classes in grade school, in high school, in college, often um, I found that history was not enjoyable because it was about memorizing dates and saying this happened and then this happened. But real history is about a story. It's trying to tell you who you are by telling you about others who have been um, and to answer the questions of who we are as people. So we're going to see that Plutarch is well aware of that. He's going to try to weigh out what really happened, what didn't happen, but he's primarily concerned with telling us a narrative and focused on character, right? Narratives and stories are driven by characters. Who is Hamlet? What's he like? How about his uncle? What's he like, right? You get to know the characters through the story. History is storytelling, but it's storytelling with the empirical restriction, right? It's the added empirical restriction of tell me a story that has some evidence that this is a story of what actually happened, but it's still a story. It's still got that narrative component. Okay. So their sentiments are quite different as to the family. He came from the voyages he undertook. That's actually quite common with philosophers of this era to say, oh, this guy, he wasn't just hanging out in Greece. He went to Egypt and he went to India and he went to China and he traveled the world and he came back with a bunch of ideas. And that's going to apply to Lycurgus, the place and manner of his death, but most of all, when they speak of the laws that he made. So we're reading him as a lawmaker. We're going to compare him to Numa, the Roman lawmaker, legislator in this. So what Plutarch does is he'll say, hey, here's the stories about Alexander the Great, which we will eventually read. They're fantastic and it's good to know who you are as a descendant of these types of people. And then, hey, here's Caesar. Here's the way he lived his life and what he was like. Now let's compare the two. Which character was a better general? Which character was a better leader of this way? So he's going to do the same thing with Lycurgus and with Numa. He's going to take a Greek, he's going to take a Roman, he's going to take lawmakers and legislators, and he's going to tell us their histories, and then he's going to compare them, their pros and cons to each other. So that's how he does much of this. So they cannot by any means be brought into an agreement, the sources about Lycurgus, as to the very age in which he lived. For some of them say he flourished in the time of Iphitus, and that they too jointly contrived the ordinance for the cessation of arms during the solemnity of the Olympic Games. Of this opinion was Aristotle, And for confirmation of it, he alleges an inscription upon one of the copper points used in those sports, upon which the name of Lycurgus continued uneffaced to this time. So we know if one of his sources is Aristotle talking about Lycurgus, that he's going to be pretty empirical about everything. And hey, so he's saying, hey, Aristotle claims that he lived in this time, and he gives us, hey, look at this from the Olympic Games, his inscription Lycurgus right there. It's still readable. That's some evidence that he lived at that time. Um, why am I repeating that to you? Let's just read. But Eratosthenes and Apollodorus and other chroniclers computing the time by the succession of the Spartan kings pretend to demonstrate that he was much more ancient than the institution of the Olympic Games. Timaeus conjectures that there were two of this name and in diverse times, but that the one of them being much more famous than the other, men gave to him the glory of the exploits of both. The elder of the two, according to him, was not long after Homer, right? Just emerging out of solid resting in the mythopoetic, if you remember all our philosophy lessons, into the propositional, philosophical, argumentative structures of these debates. Again, leaving pure narrative and then working towards giving a reasoned argument, and then the synthesis of the two that we've looked at there. So that's at the time of Homer, sort of one foot in each. And some are so particular as to say that he had seen him, but that he was of great antiquity may be gathered from a passage in Xenophon. Okay, so Aristotle had some evidence, but I think either there's two people or he was just ancient, because here's some other reasons to think he was more ancient. So where he makes him contemporary with Heraclide. By descent, indeed, the very last kings of Sparta were Heraclide too, but he seems in that place to speak of the first and more immediate successor of Hercules, totally in mythology, right? We see this is one of the earliest entrants in uh in Plutarch's lives. So we're just barely stepping out of mythology with guys like Lycurgus who come early in this. And then, we'll get into more solid history as we go. But notwithstanding this confusion and obscurity, we shall endeavor to compose the history of his life, adhering to those statements which are least contradicted and depending upon those authors who are most worthy of credit. Okay, that's his method, right? We could argue with it if we want to look at history, say, well, maybe you should find your own primary source of evidence or something. But he says, look, I'm going to take these sources and I'm going to say, okay, if two people say the same thing instead of just one, well, that's less contradicted by the other sources, that type of thing. And, he's going to weigh the source as well. All right. The poet Simonides will have it that Lycurgus was the son of Prytanis and not of Eunomus. But in this opinion, he is singular. He's the only one who claims that. For all the rest, deduce the genealogy of them both as follows: Aristodemus, Patrocles, Saus, Euripon, Eunomus, Polydectes by his first wife, and Lycurgus by Dionysa, his second. Diacetus says he was the sixth from Patrocles and the 11th, excuse me, from Hercules. Be this as it will, Zeus certainly was the most renowned of all his ancestors, under whose conduct the Spartans made slaves of the Helots and added to their dominions by conquest a good part of Arcadia. There goes a story of this King Zeus, that being besieged by the Clitorians in a dry and stony place so that he could come at no water, he was at last constrained to agree with them upon these terms, that he would restore to them all his conquests, provided that himself and all his men should drink from the nearest spring. After the usual oaths and ratifications, he called his soldiers together and offered to him that would forbear drinking his kingdom for a reward. And when not a man of them was able to forbear, in short, when they had all drunk their fill, at last comes King Saus himself to the spring, and having sprinkled his face only without swallowing one drop, marches off in the face of his enemies, refusing to yield up his conquests, because himself and all his men had not, according to the articles, drunk of their water. Although he was justly had in admiration on this account, yet his family was not surnamed from him, but from his son Euripon, of whom they were called Euripondits. Tids. The reason of which was that Euripon relaxed the rigor of the monarchy, seeking favor and popularity with the many. They, after this first step, grew bolder, and the succeeding kings partly incurred hatred with their people by trying to use force or for popularity's sake, and through weakness gave way, and anarchy and confusion long prevailed in Sparta, causing moreover the death of the father of Lycurgus. For as he was endeavoring to quell a riot, he was stabbed with a butcher's knife and left the title of king to his eldest son Polydectes. All this background. Here we go. He too, dying soon after, the right of succession, as everyone thought, rested in Lycurgus. And reign he did, until it was found that the queen, his sister in law, was with child, upon which he immediately declared that the kingdom belonged to her issue, provided it were male, and that he himself exercised the regal jurisdiction only as his guardian, the Spartan name for which office is Prodicus. Soon after, an overture was made to him by the queen that she would herself in some way destroy the infant upon condition that he would marry her when he came to the crown. Abhorring the woman's wickedness, he nevertheless did not reject her proposal, but making show of closing with her, dispatched the messenger with thanks and expressions of joy, but dissuaded her earnestly from procuring herself to miscarry, which would impair her health, if not endanger her life. He himself, he said, would see to it that the child, as soon as born, should be taken out of the way by such artifices, having drawn on the woman to the time of her lying in. As soon as he heard that she was in labor, he sent persons to be by and observed all that passed, with orders that if it were a girl, they should deliver it to the woman; if a boy, should bring him wheresoever he were and whatsoever doing. They should bring it him. It so fell out that when he was at supper with the principal magistrates, the queen was brought to bed of a boy, who was soon after presented to him. As he was at the table, he, taking him into his arms, said to those about him, Men of Sparta, here is a king born unto us. This said, he laid him down in the king's place and named him Perillus, that is, the joy of the people. Because that all were transported with joy and with wonder at his noble and just spirit. His reign had lasted only 8 months, but he was honored on other accounts by the citizens, and there were more who obeyed him because of his eminent virtues than because he was regent to the king and had the royal power in his hands. Some, however, envied and sought to impede his growing influence while he was still young, chiefly the kindred and friends of the queen mother, who pretended to have been dealt with injuriously. Her brother Leonidas, in a warm debate which fell out betwixt him and Lycurgus, went so far as to tell him to his face that he was well assured that ere long he should see him king, suggesting suspicions and preparing the way for an accusation of him, as though he had made away with his nephew if the child should chance to fail through by a natural death. Words of the like import were designedly cast abroad by the queen mother and her adherents. Troubled at this and not knowing what it might come to, he thought it his wisest course to avoid their envy by a voluntary exile and to travel from place to place until his nephew came to marriageable years, and by having a son had secured the succession. Setting sail, therefore, with this resolution, he first arrived at Crete. So one of the things to notice is that even though it means giving up power, he sticks to what the laws say. He goes, "Look, I'm king. Oh, she's pregnant? Well, her heir will actually be the king. So we're gonna call him a great, noble, just king for the first 8 months of his life, and I'm gonna work hard to make sure he stays alive because this woman is saying she's gonna kill him so I can stay king. Maybe he wants me to, favor her and marry her and all of that stuff." He goes, "I don't want any part of any of this stuff. I want law. I want order. I want things that follow something that is as it's written. And since it's written this way, I'll be the protectorate of the child and I'll be the king in his stead. That's what the laws say." So he's following this, but the corruption's too much. So he says, "Look, I'm gonna make my way out of here. He'll be the king, whatever, but I'm gone. I'm going on a journey." until the succession can be settled through age and having an heir and all of that. Therefore, with this resolution, he first arrived at Crete, where, having considered their several forms of government and gotten an acquaintance with the principal men amongst them, some of their laws he very much approved of and resolved to make use of them in his own country. A good part he rejected as useless. Amongst the persons there, the most renowned for their learning, all their wisdom in state matters, was one Thales. Okay, Thales, of course, is who we start with when we do the philosophy lectures. He's the one who's on everybody's list as a great thinker. There were like, I think, seven lists of the top 12 thinkers in ancient Greece, and the only one on everybody's list was Thales, right, whom Lycurgus, by importunities and assurances of friendship, persuaded to go over to Lacedaemon, where, though by his outward appearance and his own profession he seemed to be no other than a lyric poet, in reality he performed the part of one of the ablest lawgivers in the world. The very songs which he composed were exhortations to obedience and concord, and the very measure and cadence of the verse, conveying impression of order and tranquility, had so great an influence on the minds of the listeners that they were insensibly softened and civilized, insomuch as they renounced their private feuds and animosities and were reunited in a common admiration of virtue. We saw earlier today, and we see again an inversion of a Platonic notion. So Plato, obviously, he valued the ordered music over the wild rock and roll stuff as well, but also this idea of, well, what if I combine the art and music? I shouldn't have said an inversion of Plato, even though he argues. Oh, I'm sorry. I see the comments here. Uh, Good to see you, brother. Okay, anyway, um, so this is, forget Plato, forget that point. It was a bad point. But so we've got Lycurgus studying law, being attracted to law, judging the law itself as this law is useful, this law is useless. And then this idea of Thales, and he connected to this notion of, what if we presented poetry that helped to civilize and tame the spirits of men so that they would be able to fall in line with a structure that was given to them. And there's a common totalitarian impulse. I'm not picking on it. We're just identifying it and saying, like, okay, the lawgiver here isn't like in Bastiat and in the natural law theorists. Well, we're here to write a constitution to restrain the laws because they shouldn't be involved in every aspect of a person's life. Instead, it's like, well, it's a paternalistic perspective, at least, that says, no, the point is to create laws that create people. The laws are what allow the people to become the civilization that they are. And so they should be involved in every aspect of their lives. And we're going to see that the laws, like Kyrgyz writes, are governing everything. Okay. So that things that you might think of as social or cultural or something, he just prescribes them, so that it may truly be said that Thales prepared the way for the discipline introduced by Lycurgus. Okay. From Crete he sailed to Asia with design, as is said, to examine the difference betwixt the manners and rules of life of the Cretans, which were very sober and temperate, and those of the Ionians, a people of sumptuous and delicate habits, and so to form a judgment, just as physicians do by comparing healthy and diseased bodies. Here he had the first sight of Homer's works in the hands, we may suppose, of the pros, of the posterity of Theophilus, and having observed that the few loose expressions and actions of ill example which are to be found in his poems were much outweighed by serious lessons of state and rules of morality, he set himself eagerly to transcribe and digest them into order, as thinking they would be of good use in his own country. They had indeed already obtained some slight repute amongst the Greeks, and scattered portions, as chance conveyed them, were in the hands of individuals, but Lycurgus first made them really known. The Egyptians say that he took a voyage into Egypt, and that, being much taken with their way of separating the soldiery from the rest of the nation, he transferred it from them to Sparta, a removal from contact with those employed in low and mechanical occupations, giving high refinement and beauty to the state. Some Greek writers also record this. But as for his voyages into Spain, Africa, and the Indies, and his conferences there with the gymnosophists, the whole relation, as far as I can find, rests on the single credit of the Spartan Aristocrates, the son of Hipparchus. Yeah, there's only one source that claims that, he says. All right. Lycurgus was much missed at Sparta and often sent for. For kings indeed we have, they said, who wear the marks and assume the titles of royalty. But as for the qualities of their minds, they have nothing by which they are to be distinguished from their subjects. Unquote. Adding that in him alone was the true foundation of sovereignty to be seen, a nature made to rule and a genius to gain obedience. Nor were the kings themselves averse to see him back, for they looked upon his presence as a bulwark against the insolence of the people. Things being in this posture at his return, he applied himself without loss of time to a thorough reformation and resolved to change the whole face of the Commonwealth. For what could a few particular laws and a partial alteration avail? He must act as wise physicians do in the case of one who labors under a complication of diseases. By force of medicines, reduce and exhaust him, change his whole temperament, and then set him upon a totally new regimen of diet. Having thus projected things, away he goes to Delphi to consult Apollo there. We'll remember from our conversations, both in mythology classes and in philosophy, it's the oracle at Delphi that prophesies Socrates as the wisest man in Athens. We saw the story of Apollo and Daphne and the other stories of Apollo in our other classes. Um, this is who he's going to consult. Which, having done and offered his sacrifice, he returned with that renowned oracle, in which he is called beloved of God, and rather God than man, that his prayers were heard, that his laws should be the best, and the commonwealth which observed them the most famous in the world. Encouraged by these things, he set himself to bring over to his side the leading men of Sparta, exhorting them to give him a helping hand in his great undertakings. He broke it first to his particular friends, and then by degrees gained others, and animated them all to put his design in execution. When things were ripe for action, he gave order to 30 of the principal men of Sparta to be ready armed. I'm just going to move this screen here. Sorry about that. Okay, click there. I can read it better over here. Okay. When things were ripe for action, he gave order to 30 of the principal men of Sparta to be ready armed at the marketplace by break of day, to the end that he might strike a terror in the opposite party. Hermippus hath set down the names of 20 of the most eminent of them, but the name of him whom Lycurgus most confided in, and who was of most use to him, both in making his laws and putting them in execution, was Arthmiadus. Things growing to a tumult, King Charles, apprehending that it was a conspiracy against his person, took sanctuary in the temple of Minerva of the Brazen House. But being soon after undeceived, and having taken an oath of them that they had no designs against him, he quitted his refuge, and himself also entered into the confederacy with them. Of so gentle and flexible a disposition he was, to which Archelaus, his brother king, alluded, when, hearing him extolled for his goodness, he said, "Who can say he is anything but good? He is so even to the bad. He is so even to the bad." Amongst the many changes and alterations which Lycurgus made, the first and of greatest importance, so now we're going to get into the laws that he wrote, right, was the establishment of the Senate, which, having a power equal to the king's in matters of great consequence, separation of powers between the legislative and the executive, perhaps. And as Plato expresses it, allaying and qualifying the fiery genius of the royal office gave steadiness and safety to the commonwealth. For the state, which before had no firm basis to stand upon, but leaned one while towards an absolute monarchy, when the kings had the upper hand, and another while towards a pure democracy when the people had the better, found in this establishment of the Senate a central weight, like ballast in a ship, which always kept things in a just equilibrium. The 28 weight, the 28 always adhering to the kings so far. I mean, that's brilliant, right? But we saw Plato's Republic, the idea of the balances between these forces. He says, look, you've got these kings that want to rule and tell everybody what to do when they've got the upper hand. You've got this anarchy of democracy when nobody respects the monarchy at all and the people are doing whatever they want. Neither of those work. Why don't we have equal powers, separate and equal, between a Senate, which represents the people, and a king? All right. He's no dummy, right? They said, oh, he was wise and he traveled and he looked at possible solutions to constitutive difficulties and legislative solutions for things. Well, all right, his first one's pretty damn good. Um, uh, I remember, I remember Thomas Jefferson having the long dinner conversations that he would have with his friends about these topics when they were drafting things. Anyway, there's that famous quote that there's a president who is dining around the White House dinner table, with a group of austere, elite conversationalists and philosophers of some kind, and he said, "Never has such brain power been sat around this table as when Jefferson dined alone." But anyway, it doesn't matter. Okay, so these are the things that were in the minds of the founders when they were coming up with their solutions. Um, so let's continue reading. As for the determinate number of 28, Aristotle states that it so fell out because two of the original associates, for want of courage, fell off from the enterprise. But Sphorus assures us that there were but 28 of the Confederates at first. Perhaps there is some mystery in the number, which consists of 7 multiplied by 4, and in the first perfect numbers after 6 being, as that is, equal to all its parts. For my part, I believe Lycurgus fixed upon the number of 28, that the two kings being reckoned amongst them, they might be 30 in all. So eagerly set was he upon this establishment that he took the trouble to obtain an oracle about it from Delphi, the Retra, which runs thus: after you have built a temple to Jupiter Hellenius and to Minerva Hellenia, and after you have had Philede the people Philes and obeyed them into obeys, you shall establish a council of 30 elders, the leaders included, and shall, from time to time, apelazine the people between Babica and Nicasion. There propound and put to the vote. The commons have the final voice and decision. So apparently he checked with the oracle who said that. And in any event, he says that settles the question of why there were 28 because it was supposed to be 30 in total, the leaders included. So the two monarchs added to the 28 gives you the 30. Anyway, the commons have the final voice and decision. Okay. Right. The power of the veto power lies with the Senate or something like that. By Philes and Obes are meant the divisions of the people. By the leaders, the two kings. Apelazian referring to so the idea of splitting the executive branch into two is also quite interesting and something that we should spend some time thinking about. Let's see how that's structured. But anyway, imagine two presidents. Anyway, there. We'll talk about that some other time. Okay, referring to the Pythian Apollo signifies to assemble. Babacon and Cnassian have they now call Inus. Aristotle says Cnassian is a river and Babica a bridge. Betwixt this Babica and Cnassian, their assemblies were held, for they had no council house or building to meet in. Okay, so that explains why they're saying you meet in this gathering open field or whatever. Lycurgus was of opinion or on a bridge over the river or whatever. Lycurgus was of the opinion that ornaments were so far from advantaging them in their councils that they were rather an hindrance by diverting their attention from the business before them to statues and pictures and roofs curiously fretted, the usual embellishments of such places amongst the other Greeks. Okay, so this is the first thing that we're going to see. This is really strange. Lycurgus is about to give laws, totalitarian laws that affect every aspect of human life within the city state, but also laws that are very, 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 very different from anything else surrounding them. He's going to make all this up partially from his examination of what works and doesn't work. Well, one of the things he says is, "Hey, why do we have this big pillared building and all these great statues? It's going to get people in the wrong state of mind. What if they met in an open field? What if that's where you had your Senate meetings when you had something you needed to discuss?" Okay, it's an idea. Lycurgus was of opinion that ornaments far from advantaging by hindrance in the business of statues, blah, blah, blah. The people then being thus assembled in the open air, it was not allowed to any one of their order to give his advice, but only either to ratify or reject what should be propounded to them by the king or senate. But because it fell out afterwards that the people, by adding or, oh, that's interesting. Oh, the commons shall have the final voice and decision. Interesting. Wow. Oh, that's so interesting. Okay, so the Senate and the king, they can sort of come up with betwixt themselves some laws, and then they have to present those to the people who vote up or down on all of them, right? Say, nah, screw you. We don't like this idea of yours. So that's possible for them. So the people have the power of the veto, not the Senate. Okay, but so you see the Senate, it might be democratic representation, but then there's this other democratic check on the end of it. Very interesting. But because it fell out afterwards that the people, by adding or omitting words, distorted and perverted the sense of propositions, King Polydorus and Theopompus inserted into the Retra or Grand Covenant the following clause, quote, that if the people decide crookedly, it should be lawful for the elders and leaders to dissolve. That is to say, refuse ratification and dismiss the people as depravers and perverters of their counsel. Okay, you can see how that could happen, right? What's the problem of saying, hey, everybody gets an app and they all get to vote up or down on every law that Congress passes? Well, if you're submitting it to them for their judgment and they decide they know what that law means and it's not what it was intended to mean, they say, look, we just got to pull a ripcord on this somehow and say, no, 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 that's not what we were talking about. You can find other solutions perhaps to this problem, but you can see why it would be a problem and why a solution like that might emerge over time by Polydorus. Anyway, it passed among the people by their management as being equally authentic with the rest of the Retra, as appears by these verses of Tertius. Quote, these oracles they from Apollo heard and brought from Pytho home the perfect word. The heaven appointed kings who love the land shall foremost in the nation's council stand. The elders next to them, the commons last. Let a straight Retra among all be passed. So it's like the law has to pass through 3 layers um, of sieving or filtering, and it must make it through all 3 to become law. Although Lycurgus had in this manner used all the qualifications possible in the constitution of his commonwealth, yet those who succeeded him found the oligarchical element still too strong and dominant. So maybe the Senate is not exactly voted for in a representative democratic way. Let's see. And to check its high temper and its violence, put, as Pluto says, a bit in its mouth, a bit to rein it back, right? So this is interesting A/B testing and experimenting, right? It's like, well, what if we had the kings over here and we split them in half and they had to cooperate to get anything done? And then we've got the Senate, which is the group of the 28 that I've put together. They're going to be sort of the wise counselor, elder types, and they've got to compete and cooperate in order to pass that level. And then we submit what we decide to the common people, and then they get to vote up or down. But we're going to have a check on what they think the law means because we don't want them to all run off a cliff thinking that the law meant something different than what it means or to twist its meaning on purpose. And they say, okay, we got this all set up. Well, what's the problem? Somehow when we set it up, the 28 are overpowering the 30 or the other 2 and maybe the people, and they seem to be making a power grab here, and there's no way to stop them. Okay, we need another check against that group then. So as Plato says, let's put a bit in their mouth and rein them back, which was the power of the ephori, established 130 years after the death of Lycurgus. Elatus and his colleagues were the first who had this dignity conferred upon them in the reign of King Theopompus, who, when his queen upbraided him one day that he would leave the regal power to his children less than he had received it from his ancestors, said in answer, "No, greater, for it will last longer." You should get chills. Holy cow. These are people with the wisdom to say, I don't want ultimate power right now and a total collapse in a week. What I want is something that lasts because it works. And so we will put checks on ourselves if necessary. You know, if you're looking for a miracle, a real miracle of constitutional governance and power structures, you have it. The Supreme Court of the United States does not have written in the Constitution the checks upon it that it has itself decided for itself. You don't understand the miracle that you have there. To see cracks in it, if they form, if corruption happens, if you um, terrify the justices by saying you're going to add 29 more and all this other stuff so that you can have if you infiltrate that branch and destroy it, it's game over for you. When you watch a Democrat or a Republican nominated Supreme Court justice go before the idiocracy of the Senate and the House to hear people ask questions like, "Well, would you vote against Donald Trump murdering people and saying he can get away with it?" And then the person responds with, or uh, if Obama wanted to take over, things that nobody would ever do. If Obama wanted to decree fiat that he gets to take over the energy sector of the United States. Would you say right now that you would vote against that? And then the nominee says, I don't answer hypotheticals. And then you get the little clip that you need to scare everybody on the left or everybody on the right. And the politician who knew what they were doing, the worthless scumbag piece of shit, knew what they were doing when they asked that question. They said, "Well, I asked a hypothetical. It's astonishing to me that you can't even say that you would vote against Donald Trump if he started murdering people in the streets. Or how can we nominate a person who can't even just straightforwardly tell us that if Obama seized by force and instituted martial law, that you would be against them?" But the nominees say, I don't answer hypotheticals. It's not going to be good for their look, and it doesn't undo the stupid game. It allows for the stupid game that these idiot politicians are playing. But there's nothing in the Constitution that says a nominee for the Supreme Court can't answer hypotheticals, including obvious ones. There's no restriction that stops them from doing it. They put it on themselves. They put restrictions on themselves not to answer certain types of questions. You can't go before them with a hypothetical either. You have to show that you'd be harmed if they don't choose in your direction. They could, as an institution, say, "Oh boy, we get to pronounce all sorts of opinions on everything and have all sorts of influence, and then people will want to bribe us." And they could do that. They could have done it for 250 years, and they haven't, because the miracle of them realizing, "Oh, we have more authority. We are more legitimate. There's more austerity in this thing if we restrain ourselves." It's a miracle, and you're seeing a similar kind of miracle. Well, what do you mean? Why wouldn't you answer a hypothetical? It's obvious, right? I would vote against Obama if he seized things that he would never seize. I would vote against Donald Trump if he started shooting people, of course, right? Why not answer that? The reason why you don't answer that is because if you answer any hypothetical, then the rest of the world and the rest of the body politic, the rest of the citizenry have to say to themselves, maybe you got that job because you promised to vote a certain way. It's not based on your interpretation of the law. Maybe you promised to interpret it a certain way before an actual case came before you. But the respect for the Supreme Court that exists, it's you don't know what you're going to lose. If you lose that, you're going to lose everything. It's the only thing. It's the only thing with barely any cracks in it still. The judicial system in general has plenty of cracks, but the Supreme Court, you don't know what you're going to lose if you lose that. And it's a miracle. And it's a similar kind of miracle here where Elastus says, no, I'm going to accept or no, I'm sorry, Thea Theopompus says, "I'm going to accept a restriction on our branch of government here because," and his wife says, "Hey, you're gonna leave our children as kings with less power than you had." He goes, "No, no, they're gonna have more power because the system won't die. It'll be well constituted. It's gonna last forever. It has more authority and more legitimacy." These are miracles of wisdom, very rare, but powerful in history. Okay, no greater, for it will last longer, he says. For indeed, their prerogative being thus reduced within reasonable bounds, the Spartan kings were at once freed from all further jealousies and consequent danger, and never experienced the calamities of their neighbors at Messene and Argos, who, by maintaining their prerogatives to prerogative too strictly, for want of yielding a little to the populace, lost it all. Some wisdom. Indeed, whosoever shall look at the sedition and misgovernment which befell these bordering nations to whom they were as near related in blood as situation, will find in them the best reason to admire the wisdom and foresight of Lycurgus. For these three states in their first rise were equal, or if there were any odds, they lay on the side of the Messenians and Argives, who in the first allotment were thought to have been luckier than the Spartans. Yet was their happiness but of small continuance, partly the tyrannical temper of their kings, and partly the ungovernableness of the people, quickly bringing upon them such disorders, and so complete an overthrow of all existing institutions as clearly to show how truly divine a blessing the Spartans had had in that wise lawgiver who gave their government its happy balance and temper. But of this I shall say more in its due place. There are individuals, they're not the enemy, but they exist, who worship power, who worship Phaeton. He's on the throne for them. And Phaeton crashes and burns. The whole thing is destroyed. It doesn't work. The structure that Lycurgus is giving to the Spartans is a structure that's going to last centuries because of limitations and checks on power. After the creation of the 30 senators, his next task, and indeed the most hazardous he ever undertook, was the making of new divisions of their lands. For there was an extreme inequality amongst them, and their state was overloaded with a multitude of indigent and necessitous persons, while its whole wealth had centered upon a very few. This is where we're going to piss off the right. This is going to be a communist nation, and it's going to be the one that gives the lie to the question, how come there are no socialists and communist successes in the history of the world? I'm not on the left, by the way. I'm not advocating socialism or communism. But hey, every time, who are those people? Every time some conservative with a camera goes on a campus and yells at a student, "Hey, talk to me about a communist country that succeeded," what they should say is Sparta. And then what everybody should say is, yeah, if you want a totalitarian government where everybody's in the military all the time, then sure, you can have communism. I mean, it's an exception that proves the rule and it proves why, but it was a successful nation that lasted for centuries where men lived and died for the Spartan way of life. And so let's study it. To the end, therefore, that he might expel from the state arrogance and envy, luxury and crime, and those yet more inveterate diseases of want and superfluity, he obtained of them to renounce their properties and to consent to a new division of the land, and that they should live all together on an equal footing, merit to be their only road to eminence, and the disgrace of evil, and credit of worthy acts, their one measure of difference between man and man. Okay, he's going to set up a law where every young man born to the Spartans gets exactly the same size plot of land with the exact same animal, slave, like you get a donkey and a slave and a house, and it's all the same. You don't get an extra special spear that you can buy. Everybody's got the exact same property. The only way to distinguish between man and man is based on worthy acts and credit and character. Upon their consent, this is pretty radical. This happened historically. Okay. The questions of what happened historically have already been brought up, but this is the story. Upon their consent, they consented to these proposals. We'll all give up everything we have. to get rid of extreme poverty and extreme wealth. Will all have the same equal stuff. They're gonna all eat the same meals. They're gonna I mean, they live in a barracks basically. They're it's like a military situation, if you're trying to imagine how this could be possible, but they all eat the same food every single day, the same meals, they grow up in common. Well, we'll see. Upon their consent to these proposals, proceeding at once to put them into execution, he divided the country of Laconia in general into 30,000 equal shares, and the part attached to the city of Sparta into 9,000. These he distributed amongst the Spartans, as he did the others to the country citizens. Some authors say that he made but 6,000 lots for the citizens of Sparta, and that King Polydorus added 3,000 more. Others say that Polydorus doubled the number Lycurgus had made, which, according to them, was but 4,500. A lot was so much as to yield one year with another about 70 bushels of grain for the master of the family and 12 for his wife, with a suitable proportion of oil and wine. And this he thought sufficient to keep their bodies in good health and strength. Superfluities, fineries and niceties, they were better without. We saw this in Plato's Republic. Wouldn't it be better not to have those things? They argue. And then they say, but we want them. They make life better. And he says, okay, but because of that, we're going to have a lot of evils and we're going to have to go to war and we're going to have to do all this stuff. It turns out the Spartans prove that you're going to go to war a lot, even without those things. So maybe there's a historical check on what Plato was talking about. It'd be a worthwhile discussion to have. If anybody wants to join, just send me a DM and you can come on the live stream and we can discuss these things. I haven't explored those questions, but just to bring them up as questions. Okay, and this he thought sufficient to keep their bodies. All right, no more superfluities. You're better without that stuff. It is reported that as he returned from a journey shortly after the division of the lands in harvest time, the ground being newly reaped, seeing the stacks all standing equal and alike, he smiled and said to those about him, methinks all Laconia looks like one family estate just divided among a number of brothers. Not contented with this, he resolved to make a division of their movables too, that there might be no odious distinction or inequality left amongst them. But finding that it would be very dangerous to go about it openly, he took another course and defeated their avarice by the following stratagem. He commanded that all gold and silver coins should be called in, and that only a sort of money made of iron should be current, a great weight and quantity of which was but very little worth, so that to lay up 20 or 30 pounds, there was required a pretty large closet, and to remove it, nothing less than a yoke of oxen. This is wild. So it's pretty common when a new king takes over any country, that what they'll say is, okay, everybody turn in all your coins. Come in, give us all your coins. We're going to melt them down and we're going to resmith them with the new king's face on them. And then we'll give you back what you gave us. And typically, what will happen is the silver and the gold will come in, they'll melt it all down, they'll coin a bunch of new coins, but they'll throw in some lead and some other things so that they can make extra coins, and now the king can fund some wars or some big social program that he wants to fund, and that's called inflation. You're inflating the amount of currency. That's what inflation means. You're inflating the amount of currency. If there's more of something in a system, it's worth less. But what happens is nobody knows that you've inflated it until you've spent yours. So the devaluing of the money hits the people who get it third, fourth, and fifth hand. The more times it passes, the more recalculations have happened where people start to realize it's not worth as much. Now we have everything in paper or ones and zeros, and we can inflate it constantly all the time. It's a heck of a tax on the poorest in the country. Um, but he says, "Hey, turn in all your gold coins, and we're done with gold. We're done with silver. We're going to give you a new kind of medium of exchange. It's worth something, but it's not worth nearly as much as silver or gold." So one of the arguments, and again, I'm not defending this, but one of the arguments that's a good argument, and if Dr. Tartaglia shows up later, he has an even better argument for why gold is valuable. We've discussed this question a lot. But one of the good arguments is from the Austrian School of Economics, which says, well, a market requires a medium of exchange, and a medium of exchange has to have a lot of value for a small amount so you can carry it around with you. That's what they're talking about here with the movables, right? He says, I also want to have their movables in in common as well. But everyone's going to revolt at that idea that everybody has the same amount of money and not just the same amount of land. But if you say, "Look, I want shoes, uh, but I build houses, so now I need a shoemaker who wants a house. I gotta barter with him." That doesn't work. What you need is a medium of exchange that everybody wants, so that I can just sort of buy shoes from whoever, and I don't have to build them a house. I can give them some money that I got for building somebody else a house. It makes the whole thing work better. What Lycurgus says is, look, we don't want them to have gold and silver. We don't want them to be stockpiling it and concerned with it. We want them concerned with their character and whether or not they can distinguish themselves with acts of valor and courage and honesty, and not to be, using this alternative way of measuring their relative value with one another. So, how do we get rid of all the gold and silver? He says, well, look, we're just going to give them an equal amount of value in bronze, or what was it that they decided here to use? Iron, okay? So we're gonna make iron coins, but you can't have a large value in a small amount of iron. You need a large amount of iron for an equivalent amount of value. So he says, "Good, that's the prank I'm playing on them." They won't want to carry that around. You won't have the ability to store $1 billion worth of iron or move it when you wanna buy something. So we'll just make them we won't take away any of their money, but we'll trade it for something that's not as good a medium of exchange so that they'll be bored with trying to figure things out monetarily. It's an interesting solution. All right, require for a pretty large closet to remove it, nothing less than a yoke of oxen. What are you gonna do? I can bring enough iron to go buy a loaf of bread, but I can't, I what am I gonna do? Bring $1 billion worth of iron? Like, this isn't gonna happen. So, with the diffusion of this money, at once a number of vices were banished from Lacedaemon. For who would rob another of such a coin? Right? What would be the point? Oh, I found a coin of iron. Yeah, you need a 100,000 of those coins to buy a loaf of bread. I mean, who gives a shit? Who would unjustly detain or take by force or accept a bribe? Oh, you're going to sneak me a sack of gold. No, I'm trying to bribe you. I need carts and carts of iron. Screw it. It's not even worth trying to think about how to do that. Who would unjustly detain or take by force or accept as a bribe a thing which it is not easy to hide, nor a credit to have, nor indeed of any use to cut in pieces? For when it was just red hot, they quenched it in vinegar, and by that means spoilt it and made it almost incapable of being worked. All right, so you can't even use it for anything. In the next place, he declared an outlawry of all needless and superfluous arts. But here he might, so we said this is going to be totalitarian. But here he might almost have spared his proclamation, for they of themselves would have gone after the gold and silver, the money which remained being not so proper payment for curious work. For being of iron, it was scarcely portable, neither if they should take the pains to export it would it pass amongst the other Greeks who ridiculed it, right? So it's not even worth anything. If you had $1 billion worth of this iron, you can't sell it to anybody because it's been spoiled by vinegar. So it's just a token. It's not a coin anymore. So he sort of lied to them. He said, "I'll give you an equal amount of iron for your gold," but then he made the iron so worthless that it's actually what we call a token instead of a coin. It doesn't. It's if you have a quarter, you see the edges of your quarter have those little ridges because it has some metal that's valuable. And the reason why you have ridges is so that nobody shaves off the edge so that they can say, well, if I shave off a little bit from 100 coins, I can make another coin, which is what people do with coins. But if you take a nickel, you'll see that it's smooth on the edge because a nickel is not a coin, it's a token. It doesn't have anything of value in it at all anyway. And so it's just we decided this shape and this thing is worth a thing. In any event, so he said he was going to give them an equal amount of coinage in iron, but really he gave them tokens. Nobody, you couldn't even get a large amount of it and bribe or work with other Greeks and other city states. They all just ridiculed it as worthless. So there was now no more means of purchasing foreign goods and small wares. Merchants sent no shiploads into Laconian ports, no rhetoric master, no itinerant fortune teller, no harlot monger or gold or silversmith, engraver or jeweler set foot in a country which had no money. So that luxury, deprived little by little of that which fed and fomented it, wasted to nothing and died away of itself. For the rich had no advantage here over the poor, as their wealth and abundance had no road to come abroad by, but were shut up at home doing nothing. And in this way, they became excellent artists in common, necessary things, bedsteads, chairs, and tables, and such like staple utensils in a family were admirably well made there. Right? If everybody has to just do things that are of actual value, now you start saying, well, I could become very good at making a table. I could make a really, really good table because nobody's distracted with these things that he thinks just bring vice into the city. Okay. And such like staple utensils in a family were admirably well made there. Their cup, particularly, was very much in fashion and eagerly bought up by soldiers, as Critias reports, for its color was such as to prevent water drunk upon necessity and disagreeable to look at from being noticed. And the shape of it was such that the mud stuck to the sides so that only the purer part came to the drinker's mouth. For this also they had to thank their lawgiver, who, by relieving the artisans of the trouble of making useless things, set them to show their skill in giving beauty to those of daily and indispensable use. So this is something that we touched upon when we were reading Bastia this morning, but Lycurgus is grand enough in his perspective to notice a give and take of the balance of forces here that would allow for innovation and creativity. If it's strange because he's being totalitarian, but he's sort of being totalitarian to restrain and restrict um, the citizenry from going in directions that aren't in their own benefit, and it's actually unlocking a great deal of creativity. You know, if you can't set yourself apart by getting gold through selling, let's just take a very base thing, right? By being a pimp and selling the flesh of other human beings and stuff like you can't do any of that. Nobody wants a whole bunch of spoil iron, and that's the only thing you can use to buy and sell. It's like you're out. You're out of that game. How are you gonna distinguish yourself? Well, what if I learn how to make cups? And what if I come up with genius ways of making cups that you can dip them in a muddy river and all the mud gets stuck in these grooves that we make so that only pure water comes out? And we'll make cups that filter the water. I mean, they're coming up with all these innovations that for centuries no one in Greece had come up with quite rapidly. All right. The third, and they're making things very ornate and desirable to look at and artistically beautiful. And the third and most masterly stroke. So he's got two so far that are pretty impressive. We're going to do separations of powers, and we're going to A/B test it till we can get a balance of powers that works. And this will stop a tyranny from a monarchy, but also tyranny from a democracy, right? We're opposed to both of those, like the Supreme Court is, right? It's not just opposed to the president exercising tyranny over the people, it's also opposed to the people exercising tyranny over smaller groups of people. It's about liberty in that sense. The Spartans, we're gonna have to think about the question of liberty here. Uh, but these are solutions to so his first solution is the separation of powers, which the founders were quite impressed by and thought a lot about. And the second one was a social and cultural revolution that he look at how little he has to do to make it all happen. Right? Instead of saying, I'm going to pass 1,000 laws and we're going to have a bunch of troops that will arrest you the moment you do any of the things that I don't like, it's not going to work. Instead, he says, all right, well, what are these people looking for? They're looking for ways to distinguish themselves. How do they do that? They use the medium of gold and silver. But what if we just get rid of gold and silver? What if we get rid of the love of money and then the people can spend their time still trying to distinguish themselves, but doing it in other ways? And he says, look how masterfully that worked. All right, the third and most masterly stroke of this great lawgiver, by which he struck a yet more effectual blow against luxury and the desire of riches, was the ordinance he made that they should all eat in common of the same bread and same meat, and of kinds that were specified, and should not spend their lives at home, laid on costly couches at splendid tables, delivering themselves up into the hands of their tradesmen and cooks to fatten them in corners like greedy brutes. And to ruin not their minds only, but their very bodies, which, enfeebled by indulgence and excess, would stand in need of long sleep, warm bathing, freedom from work, and, in a word, of as much care and attendance as if they were continually sick. It was certainly an extraordinary thing to have brought about such a result as this, but a greater yet to have taken away from wealth, as Theophrastus observes, not merely the property of being coveted, but its very nature of being wealth. For the rich, being obliged to go to the same table with the poor, could not make use of or enjoy their abundance, nor so much as please their vanity by looking at or displaying it. So that the common proverb that Plutus, the god of riches, is blind, was nowhere in all the world literally verified but in Sparta. There indeed he was not only blind, but like a picture, without either life or motion. Nor were they allowed to take food at home first and then attend the public tables, for every one had an eye upon those who did not eat and drink like the rest, and reproached them for being dainty and effeminate. This is quite an interesting set of consequences. He says, look, okay, everyone's making nicer tables and nicer cups and nicer things because we've taken away all the distracting things because there's no search for gold. But what, you wanna just sit in your house and be surrounded by fine cushions and fine things and say, "Ha ha, I live better than my neighbor." That's no good. We're gonna make a law that you all have to eat together, like in a barracks. Everybody eats together. So you wanna bring your extra nice cup, you bring it, but you're gonna have a good day, you're gonna have a bad day, you're gonna have fraternizing with your brothers, you're gonna be talking, somebody does you a favor, maybe you trade him your cup. I mean, there's really no storing up of stuff where you get to say, "This is mine and this is me." It's an interesting social and cultural revolution here. Anyway, this last ordinance, and he's also relying upon sort of the group herd mentality. It's a lot like the way people live in college dorms. They go and eat in a cafeteria together, and there's something that you're getting out of that. That's I'm not defending or attacking any of these ideas, but I'm saying there's clearly something there that pushes people towards a different way of being and being concerned with different things. As we're going to see, the Spartans become very, very, very concerned with having intelligent things to say and making good analysis of the news of the day and seeing through fake news and coming up with solutions for the state and deciding, they get involved in actually caring about being good analysts and contributors to the conversation about what they should be doing. We'll see that soon. All right. This last ordinance in particular exasperated the wealthier men. They collected in a body against Lycurgus, and from ill words came to throwing stones, so that at length he was forced to run out of the marketplace and make to sanctuary to save his life. By good hap, he outran all excepting one Alcander, a young man otherwise not ill accomplished, but hasty and violent, who came up so close to him that, when he turned to see who was near him, he struck him upon the face with his stick and put out one of his eyes. Lycurgus, so far from being daunted and discouraged by this accident, stopped short and showed his disfigured face and eye beat out to his countrymen. They, dismayed and ashamed at the sight, delivered Mercander into his hands to be punished and escorted him home, with expressions of great concern for his ill usage. Lycurgus, having thanked them for their care of his person, dismissed them all excepting only Alcander, and, taking him with him into his house, neither did nor said anything severely to him, but, dismissing those whose place it was, bade Alcander to wait upon him at table. The young man, who was of an ingenious temper, without murmuring, did as he was commanded, and being thus admitted to live with Lycurgus, he had an opportunity to observe in him, besides his gentleness and calmness of temper, an extraordinary sobriety and an indefatigable industry, and so, from an enemy, became one of his most zealous admirers, and told his friends and relations that Lycurgus was not that morose and ill-natured man they had formerly taken him for, but the one mild and gentle character of the world. And thus did Lycurgus, for chastisement of his fault, make of a wild and passionate young man one of his discreetest of the discreetest citizens of Sparta. This isn't the first time we've read a touch up on this where Lycurgus, as legislator, has one foot uh, in prophet status, one foot in great spiritual leader as well. Um, it's like, well, it's like Christ, they turn the other cheek. It's an impressive performative solution to a characterological fault that doesn't make the fault worse, right? He doesn't say, "Let's beat him to death for violating the great lawgiver." Instead, he says, "Your punishment is to spend time with me. Let's see how things go." In memory of this accident, Lycurgus built a temple to Minerva, surnamed Optelitus, Optilis being the Doric of these parts for op, ophthalmus, ophthalmus, the eye. Some authors, however, of whom Dioscorides is one, who wrote a treatise to the Commonwealth of Sparta, say that he was wounded indeed, but did not lose his eye with the blow, and that he built the temple in gratitude for the cure. But this, as it will, certain it is, after this misadventure, the Lacedaemonians made it a rule never to carry so much as a staff into their public assemblies. All right. So we see what happens. There's tempers are flying, people are upset. They're upset that Lycurgus is daring to tell them they all have to eat together, and they're sort of feeling like, well, I'm a great important person and you're telling me I'm not, and there's no way for me to distinguish myself anymore. You're just selfish and trying to steal all the money, right? There's obviously rumors that his new friend is going around and squashing amongst his friends of rumors that, oh, why is he doing all this? He wants to be the only one with all the power and money, and what's going on, and tempers are flying, and the young man's the only one who can keep up with him, and he turns around to see him, and there's an accident. He bumps into him and he's holding a staff, and something happens to his eye, and he ends up building this temple and reconciling with the kid, and things are on a good path, but um they make a law. You're not going to carry so much as a staff into the public assemblies. If things get heated, we don't want accidents anymore. Okay, leave your weapons at the door, kind of a thing. But to return to their public repast, these had several names in Greek. The Cretans called them Andrea because the men only came to them. The Lacedaemonians all called them Fiditia, that is the changing the L into D, the same as Felicia. That's love feasts, because that by eating and drinking together, they had opportunity of making friends, or perhaps from Fido, parsimony, because there were so many schools of sobriety, or perhaps the first letter is an addition, and the first word additia from edode, eating. They met by companies of 15, more or less, and each of them stood bound to bring in monthly a bushel of meat, 8 gallons of wine, 5 pounds of cheese, 2 pounds and a half of figs, and some very small sum of money to buy flesh or fish with. Besides this, when any of them made sacrifice to the gods, they always sent a dole to the common hall. And likewise, when any of them had been a hunting, he sent thither a part of the venison he had killed. For these two occasions were the only excuses allowed for supping at home. All right. You can eat at home if you go kill your own deer, but you got to send a portion of the deer to everybody else. Okay. The custom of eating together was observed strictly for a great while afterwards, insomuch as King Aegeus himself, after having vanquished the Athenians, sending for his commons at his return home because he desired to eat privately with his queen, was refused them by the Polemarchs, which refusal, when he resented so much as to omit next day the sacrifice due for a war happily ended, they made him pay a fine. All right. So what's he saying? He's saying, I have proof that Lycurgus didn't just set this up and it lasted a few weeks, that this is how they lived for a long time. Because when Aegeus defeated the Athenians and came back, he wanted to spend the night eating and hanging out with his wife. The I'm sorry, the Spartans wouldn't let him. They said, you have to eat in public with the rest of us. We eat together. That's the law. He was so upset about it that he didn't do some requirement he had for sacrificing after a successful war situation, and so they fined him, and Plutarch is saying, "I looked it up here. He was fined, and here's the court case, and here's why he was fined," and that gives me evidence that they actually did eat in common together. Okay. They used to send their children to these tables as to schools of temperance. Here they were instructed in state affairs by listening to experienced statesmen. Here they learnt to converse with pleasantry, to make jests without scurrility, and take them without ill humor. In this point of good breeding, the Lacedaemonians excelled particularly. But if any man were uneasy under it upon the last. All right, so we're about to get into some really funny and good stuff here. Not only does he remove any desire for people to be about gold, so they have to distinguish themselves in different ways, and they distinguish themselves by producing better tables and cups and scientific innovations and things like that. But they're also all eating together, so there's no way to, hide in your own private luxury. There's great luxury in a sense, but it's all in common and no one's being distinguished. But how do you distinguish yourself? You distinguish yourself by being a good conversationalist, by making witty remarks, by taking jests well, and by making them without going too far. And so they become very sophisticated and cultured in their conversation with one another. And we're about to see that the Spartans had that as part of their education. That they said, okay, fourth graders, it's your turn. Get in a line. Everybody say something clever or true or interesting about the current news of the day and who's in charge and should we go to war and what's this guy doing? And and if it wasn't clever enough, they had a corporeal punishment. So this is what they start to value. And it's interesting. It was customary also for the eldest man in the company to say to each of them as they came in, through this, pointing to the door, no words go out. When anyone had a desire to be admitted into any of these little societies, he was to go through the following probation. Each man in the company took a little ball of soft bread, which they were to throw into a deep basin, which a waiter carried around upon his head. Those that liked the person to be chosen dropped their ball into the basin without altering its figure, and those who disliked him pressed it between their figures and made it flat, and this signified as much as a negative voice. And if there were but one of these pieces in the basin, the suitor was rejected. So desirous were they that all the members of the company should be agreeable to each other. The basin was called ta- caducus, and the rejected candidate had a name thence derived. Okay, so a caddick or something, an insult maybe. Their most famous dish was the black broth, which was so much valued that the elderly men fed only upon that, leaving what flesh there was to the younger. So this black bean broth that they made. Some scholars say this was basically all they ever ate. Plutarch is saying, well, some of the elderly men basically ate only that. But the rest of the Greeks thought it was disgusting. Like nobody else wanted to eat it in the rest of Greece. But it was these Spartans are getting together with no gold and no ambition to distinguish themselves in any way other than by character and word and deed, and they're living and dying for centuries for this Spartan way of life, and it includes eating something that most people didn't think was terribly tasty. Um, they say that, although Plutarch is saying they ate other things as well. They say that a certain king of Pontus, having heard much of this black broth of theirs, sent for a Lacedaemonian cook on purpose to make him some, but had no sooner tasted it. Okay, I could have just kept reading. Then he found it extremely bad, which the cook observing told him, "Sir, to make this broth relish, you should have bathed yourself first in the river Eurotas." After drinking moderately, every man went to his home without lights. Okay, I don't get that joke, but I feel like we ought to get it. So if there's anybody here who knows what that joke means exactly, does it mean you need to go and be on it's about who you're eating with or what? I don't know, but the Spartans were famous for their clever retorts. And he cooked this food. The guy didn't like it. And he said, if you want to like it, you have to first take a bath in the river Eurotas. We could spend some time looking that up. We will later, but we're not going to stop reading now. After drinking moderately, every man went to his home without lights, for the use of them was on all occasions forbid, to the end that they might accustom themselves to march boldly in the dark. Such was the common fashion of their meals. Lycurgus would never reduce his laws into writing. Nay, there is a retra expressly to forbid it. For he thought that the most material points and such as most directly tended to the public welfare, being imprinted on the hearts of their youth by a good discipline, would be sure to remain and would find a stronger security than any compulsion would be in the principles of action formed in them by their best lawgiver education. And as for things of lesser importance, as pecuniary contracts and such like, the forms of which have to be changed as occasion requires, he thought it the best way to prescribe no positive rule or inviolable usage in such cases, willing that their manner and form should be altered according to the circumstances of time and determinations of men of sound judgment. Every end and object of law and enactment it was his design education should affect. Let's talk about this for a moment. Most people know this, perhaps, maybe you do, maybe you don't, but 90% of the laws that affect you in your daily life are what we call common law. They're not actually written in direct sentences, say, this shall be the law. Instead, over the course of centuries, judges have made determinations about how the prescribed written codified law is to be interpreted in various subtly different situations. And those precedences have been pronounced and they've been written down. But the reasons for why such and such is a decision in this type of case, but not in that type of case, are all argued and determined in that great vast body of opinion. And it's appeals to those things and those precedences and the reasons. So, hey, this situation's slightly different. And the reason for that was this. So I'm arguing you should make a judgment in this other way. Those have all sort of been collected. And that's 90% of the law that affects you. In Sparta, Lycurgus felt like it should be 100% common law, that there should be habits and manners and education, and you should be raised in a certain way, and everybody should know what it is from the start of their early lives. And that what we shouldn't have, it seems for two reasons, is somebody feeling like a sentence that was written by a dead person a long time ago is tyrannizing them. Instead, no, this is who I am, and this is how I am, and this is how everyone around me is, and this is just the way we live would be a more lasting way of establishing the law. And that in cases where specific disagreements and contracts and things are happening, that those things should be argued in front of respected judgment judges with sound judgment. Okay, it's an interesting idea. One then of the retrus. Well, again, we're not arguing for or against any of these things. We're just observing and soaking in and engaging with the wisdom and the concepts. So one then of the Retrus was that their laws should not be written. Another is particularly leveled against luxury and expensiveness, for by it was ordained that the ceilings of their houses should only be wrought by the axe, and their gates and doors smoothed only by the saw. There's another reason why you might not want a codified law, which is if you were to write down enough sentences to describe all of how people have to live like this, and then you were to leave it there for 100 years, somebody's going to pay enough attention to find a little crack and say, oh, well, this word is usually interpreted this way. And so maybe that can let me wedge in a little bit of you can oppose the spirit of the law more easily when you have the written law. Anyway, um, so he says, look, we're going to build our houses in this way so that it's not too fine as well. So Epi Epaminondas' his famous dictum about his own table that reason and a dinner like this do not keep company together may be said to have been anticipated by Lycurgus. Luxury in a house of this kind could not well be companions. For a man must have a less than ordinary share of sense that would furnish such plain and common rooms with silver-footed couches and purple coverlets and gold and silver plate. Okay, so how is he going to keep them from keeping fine, nice things in their houses? No, go to the common meal place and you can have a nice cup while you're there, and so can everybody else. And you're eating in common with your special little social groups, cut into 15 where everybody votes unanimously that they like each other, and you can have your good conversations, but you don't go and just sit in your house and have your luxuries. Well, how do we stop that from happening? And again, we see minimal necessary force from Lycurgus emerge. Where he says, okay, I could write a bunch of laws saying, well, you can't have this and you can't have that and you can't have this and you can't have that. You have to be a person who likes hanging out with other people. How are you going to write a law for any of that? Instead, he says, oh, when we build the houses, they have to be built in this rough log cabin sort of way. Well, what kind of an idiot would put a bunch of gold and purple couches and stuff around dirt floors and log cabin? It's just not going to happen, he figures. And so it's minimal necessary force that emerges with all these consequences, according to the historian. So let's continue. Luxury in a house of this kind is not well companions. Men must not have common sense. All right. Doubtless he had good reason to think that they would proportion their beds to their houses and their coverlets to their beds and the rest of their goods and furniture to these. It is reported that King Tychides, the first of that name, was so little used to the sight of any other kind of work that, being entertained at Corinth in a stately room, he was much surprised to see the timber and ceiling so finely carved and paneled, and asked his host whether the trees grew so in his country. Right. So they're living this way so much in Sparta that one of their kings goes and visits a palace. He goes, "Whoa, do the trees grow like this? How come they're so ornately shaped? Like my house just has a log." He just can't even believe, what, do trees grow weird in this country? A third ordinance or retro was that they should not make war often or long with the same enemy, lest that they should train and instruct them in war by habituating them to defend themselves. And this is what Agesilaus was much blamed for a long time after, it being thought that by his continual incursions into Boeotia, he made the Thebans a match for the Lacedaemonians, and therefore Cleidas, seeing him wounded one day, said to him that he was very well paid for taking such pains to make the Thebans good soldiers, whether they would or no. These laws were called the retras, to to intimate that they were divine sanctions and revelations. Remember, the oracle says he's a god. He's partly shrouded in mythology, and he's got one foot in spiritual leadership as well as lawmaking, this strange Lycurgus character. Hey, we're going to be really good at war. Okay, well, the third main principle here, besides the first two that we talked about, the third main retra is going to be, don't fight the same enemy for long because they'll finally learn from you how to fight well. And one of the later kings doesn't do that. He keeps making war against Boeotia, and he says, "Look, you deserve to get wounded by them. You've been trading them for a long time. You've violated this spiritual principle of our way of being, the retros." It's kind of more than just a pronouncement or a law. Okay. In order to the good education of their youth, which, as I said before, he thought the most important and noblest work of a lawgiver, he went so far back as to take into consideration their very conception and birth by regulating their marriages. Right? We said he's going to get involved in everything. For Aristotle is wrong in saying that after he had tried all ways to reduce the women to more modesty and sobriety, he was at last forced to leave them as they were, because that in the absence of their husbands, who spent the best part of their lives in the wars, their wives, whom they were obliged to leave absolute mistresses at home, took great liberties and assumed the superiority, and were treated with overmuch respect and called by the title of lady or queen. The truth is, he took in their case also all the care that was possible. He ordered the maidens to exercise themselves with wrestling, running, throwing the quoit, and casting the dart, to the end that the fruit they conceived might, in strong and healthy bodies, take firmer root and find better growth. And withal, that they, with this greater vigor, might be the more able to undergo the pains of childbearing. And to the end he might take away their over great tenderness and fear of exposure to the air and all acquired womanishness. He ordered that the young women should go naked in the processions as well as the young men, and dance too in that condition in certain solemn feasts, singing certain songs, whilst the young men stood around, seeing and hearing them. On these occasions, they now and then made by jest a befitting reflection upon those who had misbehaved themselves in the wars. Okay. And again, imagine that. Imagine you run away in battle, and then you come back to a group of strong, naked women mocking you with a dance where they're like pretending to be like you running away and like you, oh, Jesus, that'd be pretty rough. And again, saying encomiums upon those who had done any gallant action, and by these means inspired the younger sort with an emulation of their glory. Those that were thus commended went away proud, elated, and gratified with their honor among the maidens, and those who were rallied were as sensibly touched within it as if they had been formally reprimanded, and so much the more because the kings and the elders, as well as the rest of the city, saw and heard all that passed. Okay, let's talk for a minute. A Spartan woman sees her son leaving the house to go to war. She says to him, this is what the Spartan mothers would say to their sons before they went to war. Bye, honey. Come home bearing your shield or dead upon it. Imagine a people whose mothers say to their sons when they go to war, you better fucking die rather than drop your shield and run away from your brothers out there. Just remember that. You come back with your with your shield, or you come back dead upon it. I don't want to see you if you don't if you come back without your without your shield. This was a this was an interesting group of people that Lycurgus spawned in this way. Those that were thus commended went away proud and elated, da, 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 da. Nor was there anything shameful in this nakedness of the young women. Modesty attended them, and all wantonness was excluded. It taught them simplicity and a care for good health, and gave them some taste of higher feelings. Admitted as they thus were to the field of noble action and glory. Hence, it was natural for them to think and speak as Gorgo, for example, the wife of Leonidas. All right, so let's pause for a minute. He's making the education of the women and the men, even though the men are the ones who go off to war, the exact same thing. They have to study and physically do the same type of exercise to be as much like the soldiers as possible. And they receive a kind of honor and nobility, a social status that's unlike anything other in femininity in the rest of Greece. Here's a great story of remember we said they want to distinguish themselves with verbal wittiness and cleverness as well. So here's a good story. So the wife of Leonidas said to have done some foreign lady, it would seem, told her that the women of Lacedaemon were the only women of the world who could rule over men. Right? I think in another translation it says, she was mocking her. They were, cleaning and doing something together. She met a woman from a different Greek city state who said, "Hey, how come, in Sparta, the men respect their women? Ha ha ha!" Like she was proud of the idea that they didn't in her town. And the response was, "With good reason," she said, "for only in Sparta do the women bear true men." These public processions of the maidens and their appearing naked in their exercises and dancings, like the men, were incitements to marriage, operating upon the young with the rigor and certainty, as Plato says, of love, if not of mathematics. Well put. Besides all this, to promote it yet more effectually, those who continued bachelors were in a degree disenfranchised by law, for they were excluded from the sight of those public processions in which the young men and maidens danced naked. And in wintertime, the officers compelled them to march naked themselves around the marketplace, singing as they went a certain song of their own disgrace, that they justly suffered this punishment for disobeying the laws. Moreover, they were denied that respect and observance which the younger men paid their elders, and no man, for example, found fault with what was said to Dercylidus, though so eminent a commander, upon whose approach one day a young man, instead of rising, retained his seat, remarking, "No child of yours will make room for me." Let's pause and see what he's doing here. It's not just that everything is held in common, the wives and the children are held in common in the following sense. Your job was to reproduce, to get married. If you didn't do that, you kind of had your own little naked procession that you had to be a part of, and people mocked you a bit. Maybe some people chose that way of life for one reason or another, but you were supposed to couple up. But what's happening is all of the children are looking at all of the previous men of the previous generation as fathers, and all of the women of the previous generation as mothers. We'll get to this, but essentially, it wasn't exactly clear because everything was held in common, who the actual parentage of the children were. They were taken away early from their mothers and put in these education bunkers where they grew up in groups of 15 eating together and reasoning together and learning the education they had to learn. So if you weren't a father of somebody, if you weren't coupled up and having a marriage at all, you kind of were on a lower social status because you didn't get the respect of, "You might be my father for all I know," that you got from all the children, and anyway. And all of the members of the previous generation looked upon all the children as if they might be theirs, and so they cared for them, not, hoping for competition between them, but by having an equally beneficent attitude towards all of them. He's creating one large family, essentially. Okay. In their marriages, the husband carried off his bride by a sort of force, nor were their brides ever small and of tender years, but in their full bloom and ripeness. After this, she who superintended the wedding comes and clips the hair of the bride close round her head, dresses her up in man's clothes, and leaves her upon a mattress in the dark. Afterwards comes the bridegroom in his everyday clothes, sober and composed, as having supped at the common table, and entering privately into the room where the bride lies, unties her virgin zone and takes her to himself. And after staying some time together, he returns composedly to his own apartment to sleep as usual with the other young men. And so he continues to do, spending his days and indeed his nights with them, visiting his bride in fear and shame and with circumspection when he thought he should not be observed. She, also on her part, using her wit to help and find favorable opportunities for their meeting when company was out of the way. In this manner, they lived a long time, insomuch that they sometimes had children by their wives before ever they saw their faces by daylight, their interviews being thus difficult and rare, served not only for continual exercise of their self control, but brought them together with their bodies healthy and vigorous, and their affections fresh and lively, unsated and undulled by easy access and long continuance with each other. While their flirtings were always early enough to leave behind unextinguished in each of them some remainder fire of longing and mutual delight. What you have here is a separation of the male and the female societies and a mirror image of both of them, right? The women are doing the same education. It was common in Greece for the men to exercise and dance naked and to do their gymnastic performances that way. It was not common that the women would have a mirror image of that exact same thing. And then you've got these two completely different societies of peers of the same genders. And then it's like, well, I'm interested in this girl. She's interested in me. We're gonna make something happen. We get alone together for a little while, but we gotta get back to our regular groups. Our identities are found in the hierarchy of the feminine hierarchy and the masculine hierarchy, and that gives us our definition of who we are. But we want to be together, but we're not just living together where it's all about that. It's the way he structured it. Brought them together, da, 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 leave behind their after guarding marriage with this modesty and reserve, it was equally careful to banish empty and womanish jealousy. For this object, so we've got it. So he's trying to get rid of all problems culturally and socially. He says, "Well, we've got to get rid of this snake here. Is the bickering between women who have to compete for something here?" So for this object, excluding all licentious disorders, he made it nevertheless honorable for men to give the use of their wives to those whom they should think fit, that so that so they might have children by them, ridiculing those in whose opinions such favors are so unfit for participation as to fight and shed blood and go to war about it. Lycurgus allowed a man who was advanced in years and had a young wife to recommend some virtuous and approved young man that she might have a child by him, who might inherit the good qualities of the father and be a son to himself. on the all right, so this husband and wife, "Hey, I think that guy would make a strong baby." And the wife says, "Yeah, I think you're right about that." Okay. And they just sort of make an agreement about it that way. The man sort of proposes it, but they discuss it, and that's what happens. And so all the children are kind of in common. You never exactly know, you can know, but you don't really exactly know who everybody's child is. And so the previous generation is all fatherly and motherly to all the children, as we said before. An honest man who had love for a married woman upon account of her modesty and the well favoredness of her children might, without formality, beg her company of her husband, that he might raise, as it were, from this plot of good ground, worthy and well allied children for himself. All right. So you're hanging out in the 15 group. Some guy comes up to you. He's like, "Hey, listen, I really want a good son, and I think your wife would make one, and she's well respected. And so, can we find a way to make a deal there?" Okay. And indeed, Lycurgus was of a persuasion that children were not so much the property of their parents as of the whole commonwealth, and therefore would not have his citizens begot by the first comers, but by the best men that could be found. The laws of other nations seemed to him very absurd and inconsistent, where people would be so solicitous for their dogs and horses as to exert interest and pay money to procure fine breeding, and yet keep their wives shut up and to be made mothers only by themselves, who might be foolish, infirm, or diseased, as if it were not apparent that children of a bad breed would prove their bad qualities first upon those who kept and were rearing them, and well born children, in like manner, their good qualities. These regulations, founded on natural and social grounds, were certainly so far from that scandalous liberty which was afterwards charged upon their women, that they knew not what adultery meant. It is told, for instance, that Garadas, a very ancient Spartan, that being asked by a stranger what punishment their law had appointed for adulterers, he answered, there are no adulterers in our country. But, replied the stranger, suppose there were. Then, answered he, the offender would have to give the plaintiff a bull with a neck as long as that he might drink from the top of Taygetus of the Eurotas River below it. Again, we don't quite understand what this snarky remark means. Maybe they should work on their quips. We'll see. We need to look that up later. We will. Again, with the Eurotas River. So the man, surprised at this, said, "Why, 'tis impossible to find such a bull." Granada smilingly replied, "'Tis as impossible to find an adulterer in Sparta." So much I had to say of their marriages. So that's all he's going to say. But he's arguing that this is the opposite of a licentious, libertine attitude. That what's happening is the health of the state is the primary concern, and you get status from helping to produce well-bred children, and that pretty much sex and marriage is thought of as a thing you do and get away from as quickly as possible. You keep your interest in each other that way, but also you spend your time being a part of this body of the state, and that's most of your identity. Nor was it in the power of the father to dispose. So you see a tension in that, it's interesting, right? The idea in the natural law theories of American philosophy and stuff is, well, the family is the basic unit, and it's out of that that springs the other larger associations. The inversion of that for the Spartans is that the primary sense of identity and unit is the state itself, and then the marriages are sort of a thing that we kind of have to allow to happen with a lot of restrictions and no licentiousness at all. Uh, which provides for these strange opportunities that, if we copied them today, would only be in the form of the madness of our democracy and nothing but licentiousness and cuckoldry and increased jealousy and chaos. I mean, it's almost impossible to imagine a civilization lasting for hundreds of years as theirs did, unless there's some truth to the idea that none of this has to do with licentiousness. Anyway, nor was it in the power of the father to dispose of the child as he thought fit. He was obliged to carry it before certain priors at a place called Lecce, where these were some of the elders of the tribe to which the child belonged. Their business it was carefully to view the infant, and if they found it stout and well made, they gave order for its rearing and allotted it to one of the 9,000 shares of land. So you immediately get your equal plot of land above mentioned for its maintenance, but if they found it puny and ill shaped, ordered it to be taken to what was called the apothete, a sort of chasm under Tagetus, that thinking it neither for the good of the child itself nor for the public interest that it should be brought up if it did not from the very outset appear made to be healthy and vigorous. Upon the same account, the women did not bathe the newborn child with water, as is the custom in all other countries, but with wine to prove the temper and complexion of their bodies. From a notion they had that apoplectic and weakly children faint and waste away upon their being thus bathed, while, on the contrary, those of a strong and vigorous habit acquire firmness and get a temper by it, like steel. So even the ones that got the visual approval had to survive being bathed in wine just to be a part of the club. There's like a military fraternal what's the word? Hazing process to be involved in any aspect of their life, including a life or death version of that when you're an infant. There was much care and art too used by the nurses. They had no swaddling bands. The children grew up free and unconstrained in limb and form, and not dainty and fanciful about their food, not afraid of the dark or of being left alone, without any peevishness or ill humor or crying. Upon this account, Spartan nurses were often brought up or hired by people of other countries. And it is recorded that she who suckled Alcibiades was a Spartan. Okay, that's some interesting news I did not know. Huh. Can see why that rumor would have been started even if it wasn't true, but okay. We've had occasion to talk about Alcibiades, and we will in other contexts. Who, however, if fortunate in his nurse, was not so in his preceptor, his guardian. Pericles, as Plato tells us, chose a servant for that office called Sopyrus, no better than any common slave. I see. He's saying it wasn't the nursing that made him such a foul creature. He had good nursing. There's some other educational problems for him. Okay. Lycurgus was of another mind. He would not have masters bought out of the market for his young Spartans, nor such as should sell their pains. Nor was it lawful indeed for the father himself to breed up the children after his own fancy. But as soon as they were 7 years old, they were to be enrolled in certain companies and classes where they all lived under the same order and discipline, doing their exercises and taking their play together. Of these, he who showed the most conduct and courage was made captain. They had their eyes always upon him, obeyed his orders, and underwent patiently whatsoever punishment he inflicted, so that the whole course of their education was one continued exercise of a ready and perfect obedience. The old men, too, were spectators of their performances and often raised quarrels and disputes among them to have a good opportunity of finding out their different characters and of seeing which would be valiant, which a coward, when they should come to more dangerous encounters. This happens in many countries today. Um, it's easy for people to be judgmental, but the rougher the situation of life, the rougher you want to be in making sure people are prepared, perhaps. I, I'm not making an argument one side or the other, but if we want to play with the argument for this, there are certainly cultures in the world today, many of them, where you will find fourth graders surrounded by their elderly relatives around the school, prodding them into insulting their classmates until they can get a fight between the two of them. And they sort of praise the victor and ridicule and abuse the child who loses. It's rough business. Reading and writing they gave them just enough to serve their turn. Their chief care was to make them good subjects and to teach them to endure pain and conquer in battle. To this end, as they grew in years, their discipline was proportionately increased. Their heads were close clipped. They were accustomed to go barefoot and, for the most part, to play naked. After they were 12 years old, they were no longer allowed to wear any undergarments. They had one coat to serve them a year. Their bodies were hard and dry, but with but little acquaintance of baths and unguents. These human indulgences they were allowed only on some few particular days in the year. They lodged together in little bands upon beds made of the rushes which grew by the banks of the river Eurotas. which they were to break off with their hands without a knife. If it were winter, they mingled some thistledown with their rushes, which it was thought had the property of giving warmth. By the time they were come to this age, there was not any of the more hopeful boys who had not a lover to bear him company. The older men too had an eye upon them, coming often to the grounds to hear and see them contend either in wit or strength with one another, and this as seriously and with as much concern as if they were their fathers, their tutors, or their magistrates, so that there scarcely was any time or place without someone present to put them in mind of their duty and punish them if they had neglected it. Besides all this, there was always one of the best and honestest men in the city appointed to undertake the charge and governance of them. You can remember what we read in Plato's Republic. That was all hypothetical. This is actually happening. It's a heck of an accomplishment. I'm not saying good or bad. I'm saying what a thing to accomplish. Besides all this, there was always one of the best and honestest men of the city appointed to take the governance of them. He again arranged them into their several bands and set over each of them for the captain the most temperate and boldest of those they called irons, who were usually 20 years old, 2 years out of the boys. And the eldest of the boys, again, were Melirians, as much as to say, who would shortly be men. This young man, therefore, was their captain when they fought, and their master at home, using them for the offices of his house, sending the oldest of them to fetch wood, and the weaker and less able to gather salads and herbs. And these they must either go without or steal, which they did by creeping into gardens or conveying themselves cunningly and closely into the eating houses if they were taken in the fact. All right, what's going on here? They did not allot, Lycurgus made sure they did not allot enough food to the children. The children would not be given enough food. Why? So that they could learn to be good soldiers. Soldiers have to find food. Soldiers have to figure out how to get away with stealing things and supporting themselves when they're in faraway lands and nothing to support them. If a child was caught stealing, it was a very big punishment. So they weren't saying, "Let's celebrate stealing," but they were forcing them to learn how to be cunning. Closely into the eating houses, if they were taken effect, they were whipped without mercy for thieving so ill and awkwardly. So they weren't really punished for stealing, but for being caught stealing. They stole too all other meat they could lay their hands on, looking out and watching all opportunities when people were asleep or more careless than usual. If they were caught, they were not only punished with whipping, but hunger too, being reduced to their ordinary allowance, which was but very slender and so contrived on purpose that they might set about to help themselves and be forced to exercise their energy and address. This was the principal design of their hard fare. There was another, not inconsiderable, that they might grow taller, for the vital spirits, not being overburdened and oppressed by too great a quantity of nourishment, which necessarily discharges itself into thickness and breadth, do by their natural lightness rise, and the body, giving and yielding because it is pliant, grows in height. The same thing seems also to conduce to beauty of shape. A dry and lean habit is a better subject for nature's configuration, which the gross and overfed are too heavy to submit to properly. Just as we find that women who take physic whilst they are with child bear leaner and smaller children, but better shaped and prettier children, the material they come to having been more pliable and easily molded. The reason, however, I leave others to determine. So we're not exactly sure how this works out, but they seem to look pretty healthy. And so the science of it will leave as an open question a little bit. All right, to return from whence we have digressed, so seriously did the Lacedaemonian children go about their stealing. This is a good story now. That a youth, having stolen a young fox, hid it under his cloak, suffered it to tear out his very bowels with its teeth and claws, and died upon the place rather than let it be seen. Okay, we're going to start to learn about the character of the Spartans. It's pretty ridiculously impressive. This 12-year-old, I believe, or some youth, stole a fox. He got caught. He didn't want to admit that he had stolen the fox, so he hid it under his coat, and he looked as though he was in no pain, stood there denying that he had stolen anything, acted fine until the fox killed him. He just refused to submit to the idea of being caught. He maintained the fox in his coat until he died. What is practiced to this very day in Lacedaemon is enough to gain credit to this story, right? Hey, if you're wondering if that really happened, go check out how they're acting today, he says. For I myself have seen several of the youths endure whipping to death at the foot of the altar of Diana, surnamed Orthia. The Iren, or undermaster, used to stay a little with them after supper, and one of them he bade to sing a song. To another, he put a question which required an advised and deliberate answer. For example, who was the best man in the city? What he thought of such and such an action of such a man. They used them thus early to pass a right judgment upon persons and things and to inform themselves of the abilities or defects of their countrymen. If they had not an answer ready to the question, who was a good or who an ill reputed citizen, they were looked upon as of a dull and careless disposition, and to have little or no sense of virtue and honor. Besides this, they were to give a good reason for what they said, and in as few words and as comprehensive as might be. He that failed of this, or answered not to the purpose, had his thumb bit by his master. Sometimes, so again, in these groups of 12 or so, there's the one that's in charge who has the greatest sense of courage and virtue as picked by the other elder men. And one of the regular routines is to say, "Hey, what do you think of General so and so? What do you think of Donald Trump? What do you think of the politics going on in the state? Tell me who's a good person and not a good person." And you had to speak pithily and in a short amount of words, tersely, and you had to be witty about it. And if you didn't give a good answer, you got punished. That was the corporeal punishment, was the biting on the thumb. Sometimes the Iron did this in the presence of the old men and magistrates, that they might see whether he punished them justly and in due measure or not. So there was a check with the older men. Are you making the right judgments? Maybe the kid did give a good answer. Maybe you're the one not understanding. And when he did amiss, they would not reprove him before the boys, but when they were gone, he was called to an account and underwent correction if he had run afar into either of the extremes of indulgence or severity. Right? So there's like a check above it. So the eldest kid is kind of in charge of the education of this group of guys that are, got to give answers for what they think about things. And if you don't punish him when he gives a bad answer, or you punish him too much with a good answer, the elder men are going to notice, and they're going to wait until you're not around the boys to not ruin their respect for you, but they're going to correct you on that. All right. Their lovers and favors too had a share in the young boy's honor or disgrace. And there goes the story that one of them was fined by the magistrates because the lad whom he loved cried out effeminately as he was fighting. And though this sort of love was so approved among them that the most virtuous matrons would make professions of it to young girls, yet rivalry did not exist. And if several men's fancies met in one person, it was rather the beginning of an intimate friendship, whilst they all jointly conspired to render the object of their affection as accomplished as possible. Sorry, one second. Pop in our ears. Okay. Let's just skip on. We can talk about this, but they taught them also to speak with a natural and graceful raillery, and to comprehend much matter of thought in few words. For Lycurgus, who ordered, as we saw, that a great piece of money should be but of an inconsiderable value, on the contrary, would allow no discourse to be current which did not contain in few words a great deal of useful and curious sense. Children in Sparta, by habit of long silence, came to give just and sententious answers. For indeed, as loose and incontinent livers are seldom fathers of many children. Oh, yeah, livers seldom fathers of many children, so loose and incontinent talkers are seldom or originate many sensible words. King Aegeus, when some Athenian laughed at their short swords and said that the jugglers on the stage swallowed them with ease, answered him, "We find them long enough to reach our enemies with." And as their swords were short and sharp, so it seems to me were their sayings. They reach the point and arrest the attention of the hearers better than any. Lycurgus himself seems to have been short and sententious. if we may trust the anecdotes of him, as appears by his answer to one who, by all means, would set up democracy in Lacedaemon. Begin, friend, said he, and set it up in your family. Another asked him why he allowed of such mean and trivial sacrifices to the gods. He replied, "Hmm, that we may always have something to offer them." Being asked what sort of martial exercises or combats he approved of, he answered, "All sorts, except that in which you stretch out your hands." Similar answers addressed to his countrymen by letter are ascribed to him as being consulted, not consulted how they might best oppose an invasion of their enemies. He returned this answer by continuing poor and not coveting each man to be greater than his fellow. Being consulted again whether it was requisite to enclose the city within a wall, he sent them word, "The city is well fortified, which hath a wall of men instead of brick." But whether these letters are counterfeit or not is not easy to determine. There's another story of Lycurgus. Um, so let's tell a story quickly. Alexander the Great is coming in and conquering Greece, and on his shield, he has inscribed Alexander the Great, King of Greece, and in small letters underneath, it's except for Sparta, except for Sparta. Why? Well, if he hadn't said except for Sparta, he wouldn't have been king of Greece. The Spartans were warriors to contend with, and you just sort of pass right by them. There's a story where the army is passing by Sparta, Lacedaemon, and the king is asked, "Hey, if we were to take over your city, you don't have any walls to fortify it." And he said, "You see this child over here?" The king of Sparta said, "You see this woman over here? You see that man? These are our walls. Bring it on. Bring it on. We're ready for you. Maybe we'll just pass by." But Plutarch is talking about how they were trained to use a great economy of words, to be as witty and as sharp as they can be in as few words as possible from the time that they're very young. Of their dislike to talkativeness, the following apothegms, apothe, apothem. Oh, Jesus Christ! When I was younger, I could pronounce things so much better. Apothe, a- aphorisms are evidence. King Leonidas said to one who held him in discourse upon such useful matter, but not in due time and place, "Much to the purpose, sir, elsewhere." King Charillus, the nephew of Lycurgus, being asked why his uncle had made so few laws, answered, "Men of few words require but few laws." When one blamed Hecatus, the sophist, because that being invited to the public table, he had not spoken one word all supper time, our Archidamidas answered in his vindication, "He who knows how to speak knows also when." The sharp and yet not ungraceful retorts that I mentioned may be instanced as follows. Demar- Demaratus, being asked in a troublesome manner by an importunate fellow who was the best man in Lacedaemon, answered at last, "He, sir, that is the least like you." Some, in company where Agis was, much extolled the Eleans for their just and honorable management of the Olympic games. "Indeed," said Agis, "they are highly to be commended if they can do justice one day in 5 years." Theopompus answered a stranger who talked much of his affection to the Lacedaemonians and said that his countrymen called him Philolacon, a lover of the Lacedaemonians, that it had been more for his honor if they had called him Philippolytus, a lover of his own countrymen. And Phlistonax, the son of Pausanias, when an orator of Athens said the Lacedaemonians had no learning, told him, "You say true, sir. We alone of all the Greeks have learned none of your bad qualities." One asked, Archidamidas what number there might be of the Spartans. He answered, enough, sir, to keep out wicked men. We may see their character also in their very jests, for they did not throw them out at random, but the very wit of them was grounded upon something or other worth thinking about. For instance, one being asked to go hear a man who exactly counterfeited the voice of a nightingale answered, sir, I have heard the nightingale itself. Another, having read the following inscription upon a tomb, seeking to quench a cruel tyranny, they at Selinus did in battle die. Said it served them right, for instead of trying to quench the tyranny, they should have let it burn out. Okay. A lad being off, right? I mean, it's so this wisdom of Lycurgus seems to have permeated into the understanding of the general subjects somehow with those minor but very dramatic legal reforms that he made. When you're a child and you learn about Athens and Sparta, you say, "Oh, the Athenians were philosophers and the Spartans were warriors." And uh, these average, everyday Spartans seem to have something to say about the nature of tyranny. You didn't really have to fight it; it was going to burn itself out. Those things don't last. And anyway, they have some understanding. Okay, a lad being offered some gamecocks that would die upon the spot said that he cared not for cocks that would die, but for such that would live and kill others. Another, seeing people easing themselves on seats, said, God forbid I should sit where I could not get up to salute my elders. In short, their answers were so sententious and pertinent that one said, well, that intellectual much more truly than athletic exercise was the Spartan characteristic. Nor was their instruction in music and verse less carefully attended to than their habits of grace and good breeding and conversation. And their very songs had a life and spirit in them that inflamed and possessed men's minds with an enthusiasm and ardor for action. The style of them was plain and without affectation, the subject always serious and moral. Let's pause for a second. We've read a lot of Plato in other classes. Now we can see what's going on a little bit with the Athenians' uncomfortableness of I mean, look at Socrates saying, well, we should build a city looks an awful lot like this city, which was their main enemy. And then, of course, the 30 tyrants and Alcibiades and all of that. You start to get a better historical picture on the whole tension between the philosophers who are saying things to the Athenians that, maybe your whole way of life is pretty bad and maybe something very radically different, which happens to exist just over the sea over there that you happen to be at war with all the time. It adds to our understanding of all that. In any event, let's move on. Their very songs had a life and a spirit in them. Right? Plato's talking about we need music like that. Okay. The style of them was plain and without affectation, the subject always serious and moral. Most usually it was in praise of such men as had died in defense of their country or in derision of those who had been cowards. The former they declared happy and glorified. The life of the latter they described as most miserable and abject. There were also vaunts of what they would do and boasts of what they had done, sort of like rap battles in a sense, varying with the various ages. As, for example, they had three choirs in their solemn festivals, the first of the old men, the second of the young men, and the last of the children. The old men began thus: We once were young and brave and strong. The young men answered them, singing, And we're so now, come on and try. The children came last and said, But we'll be strongest by and by. It's kind of cute. Indeed, if we will take the pains to consider their compositions, some of which were still extant in our days, and the airs on the flute. I mean, that's saying something kind of profound about the relationships between the generations, right? You've got your responsibility to hold things up now, and you're shouting out your understanding of that responsibility in response to those who used to have it and used to be it, who you know you will be like one day. And also don't forget we're getting better all the time, and there's a new generation coming up. That's and it lets the kids participate. It's quite an interesting thing. I forgot about that. Anyway, indeed, if we take the pains to consider the composition, some of which were still extant in our days, and the airs on the flute to which they march when going to battle, we shall find that Terpander and Pindar had reason to say that music and valor were allied. The first says of Lycodemon, the spear and song in her do meet, and justice walks about her street. And Pindar says, counsels of wise elders here, and the young men's conquering spear, and dance and song and joy appear. Both describing the Spartans as no less musical than warlike, in the words of one of their own poets, quote, with the iron stern and sharp comes the playing on the harp. For indeed, before they engaged in battle, the king first did sacrifice to the muses, in all likelihood to put them in mind of the manner of their education and of the judgment that would be passed upon their actions. And thereby to and remember they're going to sing songs, good or ill, for how well you perform here. But also remember what Plato says about the soul and lining it up musically and all of this, and how certain types of meter and rhyme are to be outlawed, and you need this type of music, is what he's talking about. And thereby to animate them to the performance of exploits that should deserve a record. Also, though, with the poets here saying that they're joined in one, it's almost like their warring was a dancing or a performance or something that could be inspired by the muses. In any event, let's move on. At such times, too, the Lacedaemonians abated a little the severity of their manners in favor of their young men, suffering them to curl and adorn their hair, to have costly arms and fine clothes, and were well pleased to see them like proud horses neighing and pressing to the course. And therefore, as soon as they came to be well grown, they took a great deal of care of their hair, to have it parted and trimmed, especially against a day of battle, pursuant to a saying recorded of the lawgiver, that a large head of hair added beauty to a good face and terror to an ugly one. When they were in the field, their exercises were generally more moderate, their fare not so hard, nor so strict a hand held over them by their officers, so that they were the only people in the world to whom war gave repose. When the army was drawn up in battle array, oh man, that reminds me of the quote. Huh, ah, damn. So in the fourth section of Nietzsche's Zarathustra, Zarathustra is talking to figureheads of state who recognize themselves to be mere shadows and puppets of what kings used to be, but who have within themselves the true kingly inspirational character. Um, i- i- in whatever they have a thread of gold within them, and he's talking with them, and they're getting excited as he does in that section, baiting different people who can't swallow some of his teaching, but who are attracted to the honey bait of other aspects of it. And strict hand officers, only people who gave repose, right? And the teaching was that you should value peace as a time to prepare for the next war, and the short peace you should value more than the long peace. Yet another philosopher talking about Sparta, um, without talking about Sparta necessarily. And the other notion was that the good war hollows any cause, whereas others say it's the good cause that hollows the war. These are ideas that we'll have a chance to explore more in other classes, but let's just notice them here in the Spartan formula and constitution. We're not endorsing or arguing against them. We're just noticing them. Right. So in any event, when their army was drawn up in battle array and the enemy near, the king sacrificed a goat, commanded the soldiers to set their garlands upon their heads, and the pipers to play the tune of the hymn of Castor to Castor, and himself began the paean of advance. It was at once a magnificent and a terrible sight to see them march on to the tune of their flutes without any disorder in their ranks, any discomposure in their minds, or change in their countenance, calmly and cheerfully moving with the music to the deadly fight. Men in this temper were not likely to be possessed with fear or any transport of fury, but with the deliberate valor of hope and assurance, as if some divinity were attending and conducting them. The king had always about his person someone who had been crowned in the Olympic Games, and upon his account, a Lacedaemonian is said to have refused a considerable present which was offered to him upon condition that he would not come into the lists. And when he had, with much to do, thrown his antagonist, some of the spectators saying to him, "And now, Sir Lacedaemonian, what are you the better for your victory?" He answered, smiling, "I shall fight next the king." After they had routed an enemy, they pursued him till they were well assured of the victory, and then they sounded a retreat, thinking it base and unworthy of a Grecian people to cut men in pieces, who had given up and abandoned all resistance. This manner of dealing with their enemy did not only show magnanimity, but was politic too, for knowing that they killed only those who made resistance and gave quarter to the rest, men generally thought it their best way to consult their safety by flight. Okay, we have a really interesting group of people here. We haven't talked much about their attitude towards war, but remember one of the three main pronouncements, these sort of higher than law, almost divine things that's being pronounced to them is you don't fight a lot with a specific enemy because he'll learn how to fight against you, right? The point is that's quite interesting. David Grossman's book on killing is useful here. Um, when you march and you make yourself large and you're visible and you're easily seen and you're playing flutes and you're putting garlands on your head, you're not trying to kill anybody. Whoa, what? When you're trying to kill someone, you put mud on your face and you hide and you move really slowly and small and quietly. And I mean, that's just what you do when you're trying to kill. But these wars weren't necessarily about killing. They were about intimidation, about submission, about dominance, about getting the other to turn and flee. And how foolish, I mean, if you wanted to kill, if you were bloodthirsty, which the Spartans clearly were not, they had the wisdom to say, "Hey, wait a minute." Because typically what would happen with other battles is between other armies from other countries is you get and you make a lot of noise and you try to intimidate the enemy. And then when they run away, then you kill them. It's easier to kill them when they're running away from you than when you're face to face. It's actually hard to kill someone who's looking you in the eyes. It's easier to kill someone if you fancy him a coward and he's running away. The Spartans didn't do that. They did all of the hard work and then they refused to chase down and kill anybody who was running away. Well, word of that gets around, and it turns out that you go to fight an army, and it's full of people who think, I could save my life if I just run away, and then we have a defeat. So you just start winning all your battles all the time. And there's lots of things that the Spartans did here that had a great amount of wisdom that obviously led to more victories, an incredible record of victories. Okay. Hippias the sophist says that Lycurgus himself was a great soldier and an experienced commander. Stephanus attributes to him the first division of the cavalry of troops into 50s in a square body. But Demetrius, the Phalerian, says quite the contrary, in that he made all his laws in a continued peace. And indeed, the Olympic holy truce or cessation of arms that was procured by his means and management inclines me to think him a kind-natured man and one that loved quietness and peace, right? This is a peace through strength thing. These are not warmongers who want war. Why? Why do you go to war? You go to war so you can steal all the finery of other people. That's all illegal in Sparta. So you say, well, why are the Spartans preparing for war all the time when they're eating brown, black bean gruel that nobody else wants to eat, and they all have the exact same property, like, who's gonna attack them? There's nothing for anybody to steal from them. Why are they so concerned with war? Well, it's peace through strength. There's no reason for you to attack us. We have no reason to attack you. If you wanna come at us, we have the maximum amount of deterrence possible, and we won't even kill you if you just give up. If we can't make peace between the nations, the troops themselves, we offer you the chance to run away and prove your nation cowardly and failing in battle. We won't kill you if you do that. All right. Well, the aim here is for peace, clearly. Notwithstanding all this, Hermippus tells us that he had no hand in the ordinance, that Iphitus made it, and Lycurgus came only as a spectator, and that by mere accident too. Being there, he heard, as it were, a man's voice behind him, blaming and wondering at him that he did not encourage his countrymen to resort to the assembly, and turning about and seeing no man, concluded that it was a voice from heaven, and upon this immediately went to Iphitus and assisted him in ordering the ceremonies of that feast, which by his means were better established and with more repute than before. To return to the Lacedaemonians, their discipline continued still after they were full grown men. No one was allowed to live after his own fancy, but the city was a sort of camp in which every man had his share of provisions and business set out, and looked upon himself not so much born to serve his own ends as the interests of his country. Therefore, if they were commanded nothing else, they went to see the boys perform their exercises, to teach them something useful, or to learn it themselves of those who knew better. And indeed, one of the greatest and highest blessings Lycurgus procured his people was the abundance of leisure, which proceeded from his forbidding of them to exercise of any mean and mechanical trade, of the money making that depends on troublesome going about and seeing people and doing business they had no need at all in a state where wealth obtained no honor or respect. The Helots tilled their ground for them and paid them yearly in kind the appointed quantity without any trouble of theirs. So they didn't even have to tend their own ground. They had slaves that did it. They had nothing to do but hang out and be brotherly with one another and try to develop their skills to set themselves apart. That the hell through character and action and nothing else. The Helots tilled their ground for them and paid them yearly in kind the appointed quantity without any trouble of theirs. To this purpose, there goes a story of a Lacedaemonian who, happening to be at Athens when the courts were sitting, was told of a citizen that he had been fined for living an idle life and was being escorted home in much distress of mind by his condoling friends. The Lacedaemonian was much surprised at it and desired his friend to show him the man who was condemned for living like a freeman. So much beneath them did they esteem the frivolous devotion of time and attention to the mechanical arts and to money making. It need not be said that, upon the prohibition of gold and silver, all lawsuits immediately ceased, for there was now neither avarice nor poverty amongst them, but equality, where everyone's wants, we have to remind you, this is historical, where everyone's wants were supplied and independence because those wants were so small. All their time, except when they were in the field, was taken up by the choral dances and the festivals, in hunting, and in attendance on the exercise grounds and the places of public conversation. Those who were under 30 years of age were not allowed to go into the marketplace, but had the necessaries of their families supplied by the care of their relations and lovers. Nor was it for the credit of elderly men to be seen too often in the marketplace. It was esteemed more suitable for them to frequent the exercise grounds and places of conversation, where they spent their leisure rationally in conversation, not on money making and market prices, but for the most part in passing judgment on some action worth considering, extolling the good and censuring those who were otherwise. And that in a light and sportive manner, conveying, without too much gravity, lessons of advice and improvement. Nor was Lycurgus himself unduly austere. It was he who dedicated, says Sosibius, the little statue of laughter, mirth, induced seasonably at their suppers and places of common entertainment, was to serve as a sort of sweetmeat to accompany their strict and hard life. To conclude, he bred up his citizens in such a way that they neither would nor could live by themselves. They were to make themselves one with the public good, and clustering like bees around the commander, be by their zeal and public spirit carried all but out of themselves and devoted wholly to their country. What their sentiments were will better appear by a few of their sayings. Pedaritus, not being admitted into the list of the 300, returned home with a joyful face, well pleased to find that there were in Sparta 300 better men than himself. And Cratidas, being sent with some other others ambassador to the lieutenants of the king of Persia, being asked by them whether they came in a private or in a public character, answered, "In a public, if we succeed; if not, in a private character." Archelaus, asking some who came from Amphipolis if her son Brasidas died courageously and as became a Spartan, on their beginning to praise him to a high degree and saying there was not such another left in Sparta, answered, "Do not say so. Brasidas was a good and brave man, but there are in Sparta many better than he." The Senate, as I said before, consisted of those who were Lycurgus's chief aiders and assistants in his plans. The vacancies he ordered to be supplied out of the best and most deserving men past 60 years old. And we need not wonder if there was much striving for it. For what more glorious competition could there be amongst men than one in which it was not contested who was swiftest among the swift or strongest of the strong, but who of many wise and good was the wisest and best and fittest to be entrusted forever after, as the reward of his merits, with the supreme authority of the commonwealth and with power over the lives, franchises, and highest interests of all his countrymen. The manner of their election was as follows: the people being called together, some selected persons were locked up in a room near the place of election, so contrived that they could neither see nor be seen, but could only hear the noise of the assembly without. For they decided this, as most other affairs of moment, by the shouts of the people. This done, the competitors were not brought in and presented all together, but one after another by lot, and passed in order through the assembly without speaking a word. Those who were locked up had writing tables with them, in which they recorded and marked each shout by its loudness, without knowing in favor of which candidate each of them was made, but merely that they came first, second, third, and so forth. He who was found to have the most loudest acclamations was declared senator, duly elected. Upon this, he had a garland set upon his head and went in procession to all the temples to give thanks to the gods. A great number of young men followed him with applauses, and women also singing verses in his honor and extolling the virtue and happiness of his life. As he went round the city in this manner, each of his relations and friends set a table before him, saying, "The city honors you with this banquet." But he, instead of accepting, passed round to the common table where he formerly used to eat, and was served as before, excepting that now he had a second allowance, which he took and put by the time supper was ended, the women who were of kin to him had come about the door, and he, beckoning to her whom he most esteemed, presented to her the portion he had saved, saying that he had been that it had been a mark of esteem to him, and was so now to her, upon which she was triumphantly waited upon home by the women. Touching burials, Lycurgus made very wise regulations. For first of all, all superstition, to cut of all superstition, he allowed them to bury their dead within the city and even round about their temples, to the end that their youth might be accustomed to such spectacles and not be afraid to see a dead body, or imagine that to touch a corpse or to tread upon a grave would defile a man. In the next place, he commanded them to put nothing into the ground with them, except, if they pleased, a few olive leaves and the scarlet cloth that they were wrapped in. He would not suffer the names to be inscribed, except only of men who fell in the wars, or women who died in a sacred office. The time, too, appointed for mourning was very short, 11 days. On the 12th, they were to do sacrifice to Ceres and leave it off, so that we may see that as he cut off all superfluity, So in things necessary, there was nothing so small and trivial which did not express some homage of virtue or scorn of vice. He filled Lacedaemon all through with proofs and examples of good conduct, with the constant sight of which, from their youth up, the people would hardly fail to be gradually formed and advanced in virtue. And this was the reason why he forbade them to travel abroad and go about acquainting themselves with foreign rules of morality, the habits of ill educated people, and different views of government. Withal, he banished from Lacedaemon all strangers who could not give a very good reason for their coming thither, not because he was afraid lest they should inform themselves of the imitate his manner of government, as Thucydides says, or learn anything to their good, but rather lest they should introduce something contrary to good manners. With strange people, strange words must be admitted. These novelties produce novelties in thought, and on these follow views and feelings whose discordant character destroys the harmony of the state. He was as careful to save his city from the infection of foreign bad habits as men usually are to prevent the introduction of a pestilence. Hitherto, I, for my part, see no sign of injustice or want of equity in the laws of Lycurgus, though some who admit them to be well contrived to make good soldiers pronounce them defective in point of justice. The Cryptia, perhaps. All right, so now we're going to judge the laws. We're going to get into that conversation. Are any of these things just? The Cryptia, perhaps, if it were one of Lycurgus's ordinances, as Aristotle says it was, gave both him and Plato too this opinion alike of the lawgiver and his government. By this ordinance, the magistrates dispatched privately some of the ablest of the young men into the country from time to time, armed only with their daggers, and taking a little necessary provision with them. In the daytime, they hid themselves in out of the way places, and there lay close, but in the night issued out into the highways and killed all the helots they could light upon. Sometimes they set upon them by day, as they were at work in the fields, and murdered them. As also Thucydides, in his history of the Peloponnesian War, tells us that a good number of them, after being singled out for their bravery by the Spartans, garlanded as enfranchised persons and led about to all the temples in token of honor, shortly after disappeared all of a sudden, being about the number of 2,000, and no man either then or since could give an account of how they came by their deaths. And Aristotle, in particular, adds that the Ephori, as soon as they were entered into their office, used to declare war against them, that they might be massacred without a breach of religion. It is confessed on all hands that the Spartans dealt with them very heartily, for it was a common thing to force them to drink to excess and to lead them in that condition into their public halls, that the children might see what a sight a drunken man is. They made them to dance low dances and sing ridiculous songs, forbidding them expressly to meddle with any of a better kind. And accordingly, when the Thebans made their invasion into Laconia and took a great number of the Helots, they could by no means persuade them to sing the verses of Terpander, Alcman, or Spendin, for, said they, the masters do not like it. So that it was truly observed by one that in Sparta he who was free was most so, he that was slave there, the greatest slave in the world. For my part, I am of opinion that these outrages and cruelties began to be exercised in Sparta at a later time, especially at the great earthquake, when the Helots made a general insurrection, and joining in the Messenians, laid the country waste and brought the greatest danger upon the city. For I cannot persuade myself to ascribe to Lycurgus so wicked and barbarous a course, judging of him from the gentleness of his disposition and justice upon all other occasions, to which the oracle also testified. So that's his argument, that that's a bunch of exaggerations and has nothing to do with Lycurgus. Eh, when he perceived that his more important institutions had taken root in the minds of his countrymen, that custom had rendered them familiar and easy, that his commonwealth was now grown up and able to go alone, then, as Plato somewhere tells us, the maker of the world When first he saw it existing and beginning in motion, felt joy. Even so, Lycurgus, viewing with joy and satisfaction the greatness and beauty of his political structure, now fairly at work and in motion, conceived the thought to make it immortal too, and as far as human forecast could reach, to deliver it down unchangeable to posterity. He called an extraordinary assembly of all the people and told them that he now thought everything reasonably well established, both for the happiness and the virtue of the state, but that there was one thing still behind of the greatest importance, which he thought it not fit to impart until he had consulted the oracle. In the meantime, his desire was that they would observe the laws without any the least alteration until his return, and then he would do as the gods should direct him. They all consented readily, and bade him hasten his journey. But before he departed, he administered an oath to the two kings, the Senate, and the whole commons to abide by and maintain the established form of polity until Lycurgus should be come back. This done, he set out for Delphi, and having sacrificed to Apollo, asked him whether the laws he had established were good and sufficient for a people's happiness and virtue. The oracle answered that the laws were excellent and that the people, while it observed them, should live in the height of renown. Lycurgus took the oracle in writing and sent it over to Sparta. And having sacrificed the second time to Apollo and taken leave of his friends and his son, he resolved that the Spartans should not be released from the oath they had taken, and that he would, of his own act, close his life where he was. He was now at that age in life in which life was still tolerable and yet might be quitted without regret. Everything, moreover, about him was in a sufficiently prosperous condition. He, therefore, made an end of himself by a total abstinence from food, thinking it a statesman's duty to make his very death, if possible, an act of service to the state, and even in the end of his life, to give some example of virtue and effect upon some useful and affect some useful purpose. Right? There's more food for everybody if he doesn't eat. He would, on the one hand, crown and consummate his own happiness by a death suitable to so honorable a life, and on the other, would secure to his countrymen the enjoyment of the advantages he had spent his life in obtaining for them, since they had solemnly sworn to maintenance of his institutions until he returned, which he's obviously not going to ever do now. Nor was he deceived in his expectations, for the city of Lacedaemon continued the chief city of all Greece for the space of 500 years, in strict observance of Lycurgus's laws, in all which time there was no manner of alteration made, during the reign of 14 kings down to the time of Agis, the son of Archidamus, for the new creation of the Ephori, though thought to be in favor of the people, was so far from diminishing that it very much heightened the aristocratical character of the government. In the time of Agis, gold and silver first flowed into Sparta, and with them all. Okay, so it lasts for 500 years until the time of Agis. Gold and silver start to come in. There's a corruption of the system. By the way, this is an unbroken political tradition twice as long as the United States so far, and the United States has the longest unbroken political tradition in the world, I believe. If you take other countries and go back, there's usurpations and revolutions more recent than in the last 250 years. But corruption starts to seep in at some point that you start to go, oh, I've got a special gold spear. Mine's a little better than yours. And now we're going to start to be concerned with those things. So in the time of Agis, gold and silver first flowed into Sparta, and with them all those mischiefs which attend the immoderate desire of riches. Lysander promoted this disorder, for by bringing in rich spoils from the wars, although himself incorrupt, he yet by this means filled his country with avarice and luxury and subverted the laws and ordinances of Lycurgus after 500 years. Pretty good tradition. So long as which were in force, the aspect presented by Sparta was rather that of a rule of life followed by one wise and temperate man than of the political government of a nation. And as the poets feigned, as the poet as the poet's fane of Hercules, that with his lion skin and his club, he went over the world punishing lawless and cruel tyrants, so may it be said of the Lacedaemonians that with a common staff and a coarse coat, they gained the willing and joyful obedience of Greece, through whose whole extent they suppressed unjust usurpations and despotisms, ad- arbitrated in war, and composed civil dissensions, and this often without so much as taking down one buckler, but barely by sending someone single deputy some one single deputy to whose direction all at once submitted, like bees swarming and taking their places around their prince. Such a fund of order and equity, enough and to spare for others, existed in their state. And therefore, I cannot but wonder at those who say that the Spartans were good subjects, but bad governors, and for proof of it, allege a saying of King Theopompus, who, when one said that Sparta held up so long because their kings could command so well, replied, Nay, rather because the people know so well how to obey. For people do not obey unless rulers know how to command. Obedience is a lesson taught by commanders. A true leader himself creates the obedience of his own followers, as it is the last attainment in the art of riding to make a horse gentle and tractable. So it is of the science of government to inspire men with a willingness to obey. The Lacedaemonians inspired men not with a mere willingness, but with an absolute desire to be their subjects. For they did not send petitions to them for ships or money or a supply of armed men, but only for a Spartan commander. And having obtained one, used him with honor and reverence. So the Sicilians behaved to Gylippus, the Chalcidians to Brasidas, and all the Greeks in Asia to Lysander, Callicratitus, and Agesilaus. They styled them the composers and chasteners of each people or prince they were sent to, and had their eyes always fixed upon the city of Sparta itself, as the perfect model of good manners and wise government. The rest seemed as scholars, they the masters of Greece. And to this Stratonicus pleasantly alluded when in jest he pretended to make a law that the Athenians should conduct religious processions and the mysteries. The Eleans should preside at the Olympic Games. And if either did amiss, the Lacedaemonians be beaten. Antisthenes, too, one of the scholars of Socrates, said in earnest of the Thebans, when they were elated by their victory at Leuctra, that they looked like schoolboys who had beaten their master. However, it was not the design of Lycurgus that his city should govern a great many others. He thought rather that the happiness of a state, as of a private man, consisted chiefly in the exercise of virtue and in the concord of the inhabitants. His aim, therefore, in all his arrangements was to make and keep them free minded, self dependent, and temperate. And therefore, all those who have written well on politics, as Plato, Diogenes, and Zeno, have taken Lycurgus for their model, leaving behind them, however, mere projects and words. Whereas Lycurgus was the author, not in writing, but in reality, of a government which none else could so much as copy. While men in general have treated the individual philosophic character as unattainable, he, by the example of a complete philosophic state, raised himself high above all other lawgivers of Greece. And so Aristotle says they did him less honor at Lacedaemon after his death than he deserved, although he has a temple there, and they offer sacrifices yearly to him as to a god. It is reported that when his bones were brought home to Sparta, his tomb was struck with lightning, an accident which befell no eminent person but himself and Euripides, who was buried at Arethusa in Macedonia. And it may serve the poet's admirers as a testimony in his favor that they had in this the same fate with that holy man and favorite of the gods. Some say Lycurgus died in Syra. Apollothemus says after he had come to Elis, Timaeus and A- Aristoxenus that he ended his life in Crete. Aristoxenus adds that his tomb is shown by the Cretans in the district of Pergamus near the Stranger's Road. He left an only son, Antiorus, on whose death, without issue, his family became extinct. But his relations and friends kept up an annual commemoration of him down to a long time after, and the days of the meeting were called like and the days of the meeting were called Lycurgides. Aristocratus, the son of Hipparchus, says that he died in Crete, and that his Cretan friends, in accordance with his own request, when they had burned his body, scattered the ashes into the sea for fear lest if his relics should be transported to Lycadaemon, the people might pretend to be released from their oaths and make innovations in the government. Thus, much may suffice for the life and actions of Lycurgus. Okay, that was really fantastic. It was a 3-hour read. I'm just going to remind us here that the reason why we're reading this, which by the way, it's fantastic, is that we've been reading and we're going to continue reading Bastier's The Law, and we had just watched The King, Henry V, Kenneth Branagh adaptation. We had watched that recently on a Twitter live stream. Both of those live streams are only on X. This one's on YouTube also. But we've been discussing the nature of the corruption of states and the philosophical constitution of certain states and how things can be reset and whether or not there's a ratchet system that pushes everything and if this is all comprehensible and understandable. So now that we've seen the conscious philosophical founding of a very strange nation that lived unbroken with that political tradition for 500 years. We will next, not tonight, but next, we will read of the time when, after the gold and the silver come in and things start moving in a direction where they just have to feed off of each other into a corruption from the original ideal, a young, wealthy person who's doing well in that corrupted system just looks around politically. He rises and he says, what if we all just I mean, this sucks, right? This is worse for everybody than what we used to have before. What if we just hit the reset button and go back to where the great philosophers who founded this nation wanted us to be? And everybody just agrees and they all give up their property and they go back to this way of being yet again. Um, and it lasts for centuries, I believe, after that again. So we're going to get into that because it's relevant to the other things we've been discussing. So the next time we get together, we will read that. If anybody ever sends me a DM, I'll send you a link to join the live stream. But we've got plenty of things to read. We're going to continue with Bastier. We're going to read about Aegis and the revival of this. At some point, we will probably then continue with Plutarch because these history lessons are fantastic, and we'll look at Alexander and Caesar and the comparison between the two, which really have quite a lot to say about who we are as Western individuals, as does this text that we've read today. So, since there's nobody here to discuss any of these things any further in any more detail, we'll end the live stream here. So, thank you for joining.